Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The quiet contagion phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as the charming, chaotic logic of a 6-year-old. I was running an after-school art club at St. Finian's Primary, a drafty Victorian building in Didsbury that always smelled of floor polish and damp wool. The theme was A Day in the Park. Canvases were smeared with the glorious, messy exuberance of childhood. Miss Vance, a small voice piped up. It was Lily, a girl with hair the color of cornflakes and a perpetual paint smudge on her nose. She was pointing at her work with a dripping brush. "I can't find the right green for the sun." I smiled, crouching beside her easel. "The sun, sweetie. The sun is yellow. Or orange, or even red when it's setting. But not green." Lily looked at me, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion, as if I'd just told her that cats bark. "No, it's not. It's green. A really bright, shiny green." I picked up a tube of cadmium yellow and squeezed a worm of it onto her palette. "Here you go. The perfect sunny color." She stared at the brilliant yellow, then back at me, her expression one of polite disappointment. She picked up her brush, dipped it reluctantly into the yellow, and dabbed at the glowing orb on her canvas. She was trying to please me, but her heart wasn't in it. I chalked it up to a child's stubborn fantasy and moved on. My name is Alara Vance. I'm 34, and I live in a small terraced house that backs onto the train line to Manchester Piccadilly. The rumble of the 7:14 is my alarm clock. My life is a carefully curated palette of routines: the walk to school, the marking of student art, the solitary microwave dinner, the video call with my sister in London. Color is my profession, my passion, my language. As an art teacher, I trade in hue and saturation, in the emotional weight of a cobalt blue and the jarring energy of a chrome yellow. My world is built on the shared understanding that a poppy is red and the sky, on a good Manchester day, is a shade of blue so pale it's almost white. The second time was a week later. My neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, a woman whose schedule was as immutable as the tides, was polishing her car. It was a Nissan Micra, a decade old, in that specific shade of metallic blue popular in the early 2000s. I saw it every single day. "Morning, Alara," she chirped, her voice muffled by the vigorous motion of her arm. "Giving the old girl a shine. This green shows up every speck of dirt, doesn't it?" I paused, my keys in my hand. "Green." She stopped polishing and straightened up, placing her hands on her hips. She squinted at the car, then at me. "Well, yes. Always been green." She said it with such unwavering certainty that for a terrifying, vertiginous second, I questioned my own memory. Had it always been green? A dark, bluish green that looked blue in certain lights? No. It was blue. As blue as a bottle of Nivea cream. "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "Looks lovely, whatever you call it." She beamed, satisfied, and returned to her work. I walked away, the back of my neck prickling. It was a slip of the tongue. She was getting on a bit. That's all. But the word green echoed in my head, a flat note in a familiar song. My flat was my sanctuary, a haven of controlled aesthetics. The walls were a soft, calming gray. My prized possession was a large print of Yves Klein's IKB 191. That specific, electrifying, patented blue was an anchor for me. It was pure, absolute. Looking at it, I felt the unease from Mrs. Higgins' comment begin to fade. It was just a silly mistake. The real tremor came on a Thursday. My weekly video call with my sister, Chloe. She worked in finance in London, a world of sharp suits and sharper numbers, so different from mine. She was the fixed point in my life, the one person whose perception I trusted implicitly. Her face appeared on my laptop screen, framed by her immaculate Canary Wharf apartment. She was wearing a new jumper. A soft, fluffy thing. Oh, that's a lovely color on you, Chloe, I said. Really brings out your eyes. Thanks. I wasn't sure about the cerulean, thought it might wash me out, but it's quite cozy. I froze. The jumper was a warm, buttery yellow. The color of daffodils and lemon curd. Not a single hint of blue in its fibers. Cerulean? I asked, my voice tight. Chloe, that's yellow. She laughed, a dismissive little puff of air. Elara, darling, are you looking at your screen properly? It's cerulean. You know, like the sky. She gestured vaguely towards her window. No, the sky is cerulean. Your jumper is yellow. They're not the same color. My heart was starting to beat too fast. Her expression shifted from amusement to a faint, clinical concern. The look she used to give me when I was a teenager having a melodramatic crisis. Are you feeling alright, Elle? You sound a bit stressed. This jumper is blue. A light blue. Cerulean. It's not, I insisted, my voice rising. It's yellow. Look at it. I am looking at it, she said, her tone hardening. And I'm telling you what color it is. Honestly, Elara, don't be weird. The conversation faltered after that. We talked about her work, about my school, but the easy warmth was gone. It felt like I was talking to her across a pane of thick, distorting glass. After we hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the blank screen. Chloe didn't make mistakes like that. She was methodical, precise. She knew her colors that I went to my art supplies, my hands trembling slightly. I pulled out a tube of cerulean blue and a tube of cadmium yellow. I squeezed a small blob of each onto a white ceramic plate. There they were, distinct, unambiguous. One was the color of a summer sky. The other was the color of Chloe's jumper that I took a photo and sent it to her. This is cerulean, I typed, circling the blue. This is yellow, I wrote, circling the yellow. Her reply came back a minute later. Yes, I know. My jumper is the color on the left. That I stared at the message, a cold dread seeping into my bones. She was pointing to the blue. But she was wearing the yellow. The world outside my window looked the same. The red brick of the opposite houses, the dark green of the privet hedges, the gray, overcast sky. But something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the foundation of everything. I went to the window and looked down at Mrs. Higgins' car, gleaming under a streetlight. It was blue. A steadfast, reliable, definite blue, but Mrs. Higgins called it green. And Chloe, my brilliant, grounded sister, called yellow cerulean. That I spent the rest of the evening testing myself. I picked up a book with a red cover. Red, I thought, holding on to the word like a talisman. I looked at the purple throw on my sofa. Purple. The green of my monstera plant. Green. The colors were still there, still true, for me. But I felt a new, terrifying fragility in them, as if they were memories I had to actively maintain, memories that other people were beginning to forget. The next day at school, I gave the Year 5s a simple task: paint a color wheel. I explained primary and secondary colors, mixing, harmony, contrast. All the things that were second nature to me. I watched them work, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. They painted with confidence. They mixed red and yellow to make orange. They mixed yellow and blue to make green. The mechanics were still there. But when I asked them to name the colors, the answers were a discordant mess. What color is this? I asked a boy named Sam, pointing to the vibrant red section of his wheel. That's sky blue, miss, he said, with the simple confidence of fact. And this one? I pointed to the blue, grass green. I moved to another table. The answers were different, but just as certain. For one girl, red was evening purple. For another, blue was sun yellow. They were all using the names of colors, but the names had detached from their moorings. They were just words now, assigned at random to the spectrum. They all agreed on their own bizarre new systems, chattering happily. "Look, I mixed sun yellow and sky blue and got mud brown," one boy exclaimed, holding up a smear of what I knew to be violent purple. They weren't confused. They weren't struggling. They were simply operating under a new set of rules. Rules I didn't know. That I retreated to my desk, feeling dizzy. I looked out the window at the playground. The climbing frame was a cheerful primary colored affair, red poles, a blue slide, yellow steps. But as I watched the children play on it, I overheard their shouts. "Meet you at the top of the green pole. Race you to the bottom of the purple slide." They were all seeing it differently. All of them. I felt a profound, chilling isolation settle over me. It wasn't my eyes that were the problem. It was everyone else's. I was the last person left who remembered what color the world was supposed to be. I looked down at my hands, at the faint blue of my own veins beneath the skin. The color was still true. For now, phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The next few weeks were a descent into a quiet, private madness. The world hadn't ended. There were no sirens, no panic in the streets. The 714 still rumbled past my window on schedule. But reality had developed a persistent, low-frequency hum of wrongness that only I seemed to hear. That I started documenting the changes in a sketchbook, the kind I usually filled with charcoal life drawings. Now it was a catalogue of dissonance. October 12, news report on BBC One. A house fire in Salford. The reporter, a woman with immaculate hair and a serious expression, described the flames of brilliant violet licking at the roof. The flames on the screen were a roaring, terrifying orange. October 15, at the Tesco in Benwich. Aisle 5. A couple was arguing about which tomato puree to buy. "I prefer the flavor of the one in the green tin," the man said, pointing decisively at the iconic red and white cereal can. October 19, staff meeting. Mr. Davies, the head teacher, complimented my colleague Sarah on her lovely blue dress. The dress was a shade of green so lurid it hurt my eyes. Sarah beamed. "Thank you, David. I thought it was very autumnal." No one batted an EYEDMY sketchbook filled with these observations, a secret history of a disappearing world. The act of writing them down was both a comfort and a confirmation of my own alienation. It proved I wasn't imagining it, but it also starkly illustrated that I was alone. And why attempts to breach this isolation were disastrous. I tried a direct approach with my closest friend at work, Michael, who taught history. We were having lunch in the staff room. "Michael," I began, trying to keep my voice casual. "Have you noticed anything strange lately? With how people talk about things?" He was midway through a cheese and pickle sandwich. "Strange how?" "You mean how everyone's obsessed with that Danish crime drama?" "No, not that. I mean, colors." He stopped chewing and looked at me. "Colors?" "Yes. People, they're getting them wrong. Constantly. They're calling blue things green, or red things purple. All the time." He swallowed his mouthful slowly, his eyes scrutinizing my face. "Right. For example. This morning, David called Sarah's green dress blue." Michael frowned. "Her dress was blue, Ilara. A sort of teal, maybe. Definitely in the blue family." "No, Michael, it was green. A bright, acid green." I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice and I hated it that he put his sandwich down. "Ilara, are you okay? You've been a bit tense. Is everything all right at home?" The conversation was over. He had slipped into the smooth, concerned cadence of someone talking to a person they believe is unwell. He saw a problem, but the problem was me. My perception. My stress levels. My mental state. From then on, he treated me with a gentle, infuriating kindness, as if I were made of glass. The wall of denial was everywhere. It wasn't aggressive, it was worse. It was placid, certain. The world had collectively agreed on a new reality, and they looked at me with pity and confusion for not being on board. My insistence on the bold colors was seen as a strange, stubborn eccentricity, like a flat-earther trying to argue with an astronaut. That why isolation deepened. I started avoiding conversations. I'd nod and smile when someone commented on the beautiful gray sunset that was, to my eyes, a symphony of rose and gold. I learned to edit my own speech, to stop myself from saying, "Pass me the yellow pencil," because the person I was speaking to might call that pencil violet or brown. Silence was safer. It was a self-imposed quarantine. My art room, once my sanctuary, became a place of torture. The tubes of paint were labeled correctly: ultramarine, viridian, alizarin crimson. The names were promises, assurances of a stable reality. But my students would squeeze out a dollop of crimson and call it deep green. They would create landscapes of breathtaking ugliness, skies the color of raw liver, trees the color of bruises, and call them beautiful. Their innocence was the most unnerving part. They saw harmony in the chaos. A new aesthetic was being born, one I found repulsive and nonsensical. That I started searching online, late at night, the blue light of the screen illuminating my lonely vigil. I typed in frantic, grasping phrases: mass color blindness, collective dyschromatopsia, sensory perception shift global. The results were a predictable jumble of obscure medical conditions, psychedelic drug forums, and wild conspiracy theories about chemtrails and 5G. Nothing matched the specific, quiet creep of what I was experiencing. There were no other voices crying out in the digital wilderness, saying, "I see it too." It was during this period of frantic research that I first noticed the other anomaly, the subplot to my private horror story. It concerned Mr. Abernathy, the man who lived 4 doors down. He was a retired electrical engineer, a widower in his late 70s. He'd always been a bit of a recluse, but his behavior had recently become more pronounced. His front room, visible from the street, was a hoarder's nest of old electronics. Radios, mostly. Transistor radios, shortwave receivers, hulking valve sets from the 50s. I'd see him on the pavement, wrestling with a new acquisition from a car boot sale, or tinkering with an antenna in his tiny front garden. But now his activity had a new intensity, a frantic energy. Lights burned in his house at all hours. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear a low, rhythmic static coming from his property, a sound that made the fillings in my teeth ache. The other neighbors gossiped about him, of course. "Poor old Arthur's finally lost it," Mrs. Higgins had said to me one morning, gesturing with her thumb. "All those gadgets. It's not healthy." I thought he was just another victim of the contagion, his obsession with radios a manifestation of the same behavioral loop that made people paint their front doors clashing, nauseating colors. I saw him as a symptom, a more extreme version of the general wrongness. I was mistaken. My world continued to shrink. I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a society that was moving on without me. One Saturday, I forced myself to go to the Manchester Art Gallery. I needed to see the Pre-Raphaelites, to anchor myself in the rich, deep colors of Millet and Rossetti. I stood before Ford Madox Brown's work, a painting I had loved since I was a girl. I knew its palette by heart, the earthy browns, the crisp whites, the shock of red in the baby's bonnet. A couple stood beside me, admiring the painting. "The use of yellow in this is masterful," the woman said, her voice full of academic appreciation. "How he contrasts the pale yellow of the lady's parasol with the deep, saturated yellow of that man's waistcoat." I stared at the painting. The parasol was a delicate lilac. The waistcoat was a rich, powerful blue. I felt a wave of nausea. I had to get out. I fled the gallery, stumbling out into the grey Manchester afternoon. The city itself seemed to mock me. The red brick of the Midland Hotel looked tired and thin. The iconic yellow M of a Metrolink sign seemed to buzz with a sickly, incorrect light. I was a connoisseur of fine wine trapped in a world that had forgotten the taste of grapes and was now joyfully drinking vinegar. That evening, desperate for a connection to the old world, I pulled out my family photo albums. Pictures of my parents, of a childhood holiday in Cornwall. There I was, aged 8, holding a bright red bucket and spade on a golden beach, the sea a perfect Impossible azure behind me. The colors were still there. Locked in the glossy paper, protected from the spreading stain that I held a photo of my mom. She was wearing her favorite cardigan, a soft, woolly thing the color of lavender. I remembered the day she bought it. I remembered her holding it up, saying, "What do you think of this purple, Elara?" Purple that I called Chloe again. "Chloe," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm looking at that photo of Mum, the one from her 50th birthday. She's wearing her cardigan." "Oh, the gray one. I loved that cardigan." My hand tightened on the phone. "It wasn't gray, Chloe. It was purple. Lavender." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, Chloe's voice, slow and heavy with a weary, sorrowful patience. "Elara. We need to talk about you getting some help. I'm worried. I'll come up next weekend. We can go and see Dr. Allen together." I hung up. I didn't cry. The feeling was colder, sharper than tears. It was the feeling of a door being locked. I was on one side, and the rest of the world, including the sister I loved, was on the other. That I looked out my window towards Mr. Abernathy's house. A strange, pale light was flickering in his front room, pulsing in time with the low static I could now faintly hear. For the first time, I didn't see him as a symptom of the disease. A wild, desperate thought sparked in my mind: what if he wasn't a victim? What if, like me, he was a survivor? What if his fortress of strange machines wasn't a sign of madness, but a defense against it? Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The decision to approach Mr. Abernathy was born of pure desperation. My world had become a lonely island of correct colors in a sea of blissful, placid error. Chloe was planning a rescue mission, which I knew would end with me being pathologized, medicated into accepting that yellow was blue. I had nothing to lose. That I walked the 4 doors down to his house on a Tuesday evening. The air was cold and smelled of wet leaves. The static was louder here, a physical presence that vibrated in my chest. I knocked on his door, the sound swallowed by the electronic hum. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. A single, bright blue eye peered out. The rest of his face was lost in the gloom of the hallway. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice dry as dust. "Mr. Abernathy. My name is Elara Vance. I live at number 42. I know who you are. The art teacher." The eye blinked. "What do you want?" I took a breath. "I want to ask you about your radios. And I want to ask you what color my coat is." I was wearing my favorite coat, a deep, unmistakable shade of forest green. It was a gamble, a single question sanity test. That he was silent for a long moment. The eye scanned my coat, then moved to my face. The static from inside seemed to swell. "It's green," he said, his voice flat and certain. "A dark, bottle green." The relief that washed over me was so profound my knees felt weak. I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. 2 words. 2 simple words that proved I wasn't alone. "Can I come in?" I whispered. The door opened wider. I stepped from the quiet, incorrect world of the street into the buzzing, humming chaos of his home. The inside of Mr. Abernathy's house was a cave of forgotten technology. Wires snaked across the floor like thick ivy. Oscilloscopes traced jagged green lines in the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of hot dust and ozone. In the center of the room, a collection of mismatched radio receivers, all dialed to the empty frequencies between stations, emitted the wall of white noise. "It's a signal," he said, shuffling over to an armchair. He didn't offer me a seat. "Been broadcasting for about 3 months now. Low frequency. Pervasive. It's not sound, not exactly. It's a perceptual override. A wash. A wash." I repeated, staring at a slowly rotating radar dish mounted on a stack of encyclopedias. "It washes out the fine detail. It overwrites complex sensory data with a simplified, more efficient version. Color is just the first thing to go. It's the most complex, the most nuanced, the most subjective part of our visual spectrum. The easiest to flatten. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of it. Where is it coming from? He gave a short, humorless laugh. The question is, what is it? Not, where is it from? It's not a transmitter in a bunker somewhere. That would be too simple. This is, a change in the background radiation of reality. A new law of physics bleeding through. Or maybe an old one reasserting itself. He called it, the hue. He explained that his fortress of static, his collection of analog noisemakers, created a sort of Faraday cage for the mind. The chaotic, unstructured noise of the old machines interfered with the coherent, simplifying signal of the hue, creating a small pocket of perceptual integrity. His madness was his sanity. But why aren't you affected at all? I asked. I'm not surrounded by this, but I can still see. Lucky you, he grunted. Some people are just naturally resistant. A quirk in the brain's wiring. Like being immune to a virus. You and me, we're the 1 in a million genetic throwbacks. Most people, they folded in a matter of days. His explanation was terrifying, but it was also a lifeline. It was an explanation. I wasn't mad. The world was done and why visits to Mr. Abernathy became a regular, secret ritual. He was my co-conspirator, my grumpy, paranoid oracle. He showed me his charts, his recordings of the signal's growing strength. He believed the hue wasn't intentionally malevolent. It was just a process, as unthinking as erosion. It makes them happy, you see, he said one evening, pointing a trembling finger at the street. Through his window, we could see a family laughing as they painted their front gate a color that looked like dried blood, a color they were all calling sunshine yellow. It removes nuance, doubt, aesthetic anxiety. Their world is simpler, brighter in its own way. They have less to process. It's a cognitive sedative. The true horror of the situation began to crystallize. This wasn't an attack. It was an anesthetic. Humanity was being gently, quietly euthanized into a state of contented idiocy, and they didn't even know it was happening, and the contagion was escalating. It was no longer just a passive misperception. The new, false colors were starting to exert a magnetic pull on the affected. People were drawn to them. A new trend emerged for clothes in jarring, discordant combinations that made me feel seasick. Houses were repainted in shades that violated every rule of harmony. Public spaces followed suit. The council repainted the park benches in a sickly mustard and pink combination. A new sculpture appeared in Piccadilly Gardens, a twisted horror of metal painted in what was described on the news as a calming palette of blues and greens, but which looked to me like a car crash of rust orange and raw flesh magenta. The world was remodeling itself according to the aesthetic of the hue. And because I could not see the beauty they saw, I was becoming more and more of a freak. My students' parents started to complain. My art classes, which focused on the bold color theory, were deemed confusing and out of step with modern sensibilities. Mr. Davies called me into his office. On his desk was a vase containing a single, plastic flower of an impossible, shimmering color that seemed to vibrate at the edge of my vision. It was beautiful, in a horrifying, alien way. Ilara, he began, his voice oozing with synthetic sympathy. We've had some feedback. Parents feel the children's work is a little drab. A bit old-fashioned. I'm teaching them the fundamentals, I said, my voice dangerously steady. Yes, of course. But perhaps you could embrace the new palettes. Be a bit more adventurous. Like this, he said, gesturing to the monstrous flower. This is the shade of cerulean everyone's talking about. It's so peaceful. To my eyes, the flower was the color of an infected wound. I realized then that my job was untenable. My very presence was an act of dissent. The stakes were no longer just about my own sanity. They were about my survival. The placid confusion of the affected was beginning to curdle into something else. A quiet, passive hostility towards things that didn't conform. Things that were still the bold colors. My forest green coat started to draw strange, lingering stares in the street. People would look at it, a flicker of confusion in their eyes, a momentary cognitive dissonance that quickly resolved into a faint, unspoken disapproval. The old world was becoming offensive. It was an error that needed to be corrected. My alliance with Abernathy was also tested. The signal was getting stronger. His equipment began to falter. One of the main valve amplifiers in his setup blew, plunging a section of the room into a silence that felt more threatening than the noise. "The capacitor's gone," he croaked, his face pale in the flickering light of an oscilloscope. "I need a new one. A TCC metal pack. They haven't made them in 50 years. He knew a place, though. A tiny, cluttered electronics shop hidden in the back alleys of the northern quarter, run by a man as old as the components he sold. Abernathy couldn't go, the exposure to the unfiltered hue for that long would overwhelm him. I had to. It was my first true mission into the heart of the changed world. I had to blend in. Before I left, I rummaged through my wardrobe and put on the most tonally offensive outfit I could create, a pair of orange trousers and a pink shirt. To me, I looked like a clown. I could only hope that to them, I looked normal. Walking through the city was a nightmare. The new aesthetic was everywhere. Adverts, clothes, cars. It was a visual language I couldn't speak. I felt like a spy in a foreign land, terrified of making a mistake that would expose me. I forced myself not to recoil at the clothes people were wearing. I practiced the placid, smiling expression I saw on everyone's faces. In a cafe, I ordered a green tea. The liquid they served me was gray. I drank it without flinching. That I found the shop, a dusty cave smelling of solder and decay. The ancient proprietor sold me the capacitor without a word, his eyes clouded with cataracts. As I was leaving, he gestured to my shirt, nice shade of brown. He mumbled, "Thank you," I said, my heart pounding. I find it very calming. I returned to Abernathy's house, clutching the small component like a holy relic. When I got there, the door was ajar. The static was gone. The silence was absolute. That I found him in his armchair, staring blankly at the dead machines. He was humming softly. His eyes were fixed on a small, red cushion on his sofa. "Arthur." I whispered. That he turned to look at me, and his face was different. The sharp, anxious intelligence was gone. Replaced by a placid, simple contentment. "It's so beautiful," he said, his voice soft. He pointed at the red cushion. "I never noticed what a perfect blue it is." He had fallen. The last bastion had been breached. I was alone again. Phase 4, confrontation/revelation and aftermath. I backed out of Mr. Abernathy's silent house, the useless capacitor clutched in my hand. The quiet humming from his lips was more terrifying than any scream. He hadn't been destroyed, he'd been converted. He was one of them now, lost in the serene, blue beauty of a red cushion. The fortress had fallen not with a bang, but with a contented sigh. That I ran. Not to my house, but away. Away from the placid faces and the sick, sweet colors. I found myself on the towpath of the Bridgewater Canal, the water a murky, honest brown. For a while, the muted tones of nature were a balm. The deep green of the canal-side weeds, the gray stone of the locks, the russet brown of decaying leaves. These were colors that hadn't yet been recategorized, colors without brand names or fashionable appeal. They were safe. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Chloe. I knew what this was. This was the intervention. She had come up from London as promised. "Ilara. Where are you?" "I'm at your house." Her voice was strained with forced calm. "I'm just out for a walk," I said, my own voice a stranger's. "Please come home. We need to talk. I'm worried sick." "We." The word hit me like a stone. She wasn't alone. I imagined her in my living room with a doctor, or worse, just with that unshakable certainty that she was right and I was broken. "Chloe," I said, a final, desperate plea. "Look at my Eve Klein print. The big one in the living room. Just look at it and tell me, honestly, what color is it? There was a pause. I heard her footsteps on the wooden floor. I'm looking at it now, she said. It's a beautiful, rich shade of yellow. Like a field of sunflowers. It's lovely, Elle. But it's just a picture. You're what matters. The last thread snapped. That vibrant, defiant, perfect blue, my anchor in a world of shifting tides, was now a field of sunflowers. The hue had taken it from me, had rewritten it in my own home. This was the confrontation. Not with a monster or a villain, but with a choice. My phone buzzed again with a text from Chloe. Please, Elara. We can fix this, fix me. Make me see the yellow. Make me well that I walked for hours, until the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky. I ended up at Castlefield, amidst the Roman ruins and the rust-colored iron bridges. The sky above me was a masterpiece of deep violet and fading orange, but I knew that on the television, the weather reporter would be describing the lovely gray and green tones of the evening. The truth, as Abernathy had hinted, was that there was nothing to fight. You couldn't punch a perceptual shift. You couldn't reason with a change in the laws of reality. It wasn't coming from a source that could be switched off. It was simply the new weather. The new climate of the human soul. To fight it was to stand on a beach and command the tide to stop. My choice was stark. I could become a hermit like Abernathy, building a new bunker, guarding the memory of a world no one else wanted or remembered. A lonely, bitter curator of a dead museum. Or I could let go. I could stop fighting the current, stop swimming against the tide of perception, and allow the hue to wash over me. I could learn to see the beauty in the sunflower yellow climb, to find peace in the cerulean wound blossom, to join the placid, smiling majority. I could be fixed. The thought was seductive in its horror. The idea of relief, of an end to the strain of constant cognitive dissonance. An end to the loneliness, but there was a third path. The path of the spy, the counterfeiter. The path I had unwittingly started on when I bought the capacitor. Not acceptance, not resistance, but adaptation. That I found a bench and sat down, the cold of the metal seeping through my coat. I took out my phone and looked at a photo I had of a perfect, red rose from my mother's old garden. Red, I thought. The memory is red. Then I looked at it again, and I tried. I forced myself to see it through their eyes. I blurred its edges in my mind, flattened its complexity, and tried to find the word they might use. Sky bright, perhaps. Or leaf sharp. It was like learning a new language, a language that contradicted everything I knew to be true. It was exhausting. It was painful. But it might be possible that I could live a double life. Inwardly, I would be a sanctuary for the old world, a keeper of the lost spectrum. I would remember the impossible blue of the sea in Cornwall, the exact shade of my mother's lavender cardigan, the glorious, defiant red of a poppy. Outwardly, I would learn the new tongue. I would learn to praise the brown shirts and the gray tea. I would learn to nod and agree that the sky was a lovely shade of violet. I would become a fluent, impeccable liar. That I walked home. The streets were quiet. Through their windows, I could see families bathed in the cool, placid light of their televisions, their faces untroubled. They were calm. They were content. They were free. When I reached my house, Chloe was waiting on the step, her face a mask of anxiety. She was wearing the yellow jumper. My beautiful, foolish, lost sister. Oh, Elara, thank God, she breathed, rushing to hug me. The jumper felt soft against my cheek. That I hugged her back. I looked over her shoulder at my front door, which was painted a sensible, traditional dark blue. I'm sorry, I said, my voice muffled in her shoulder. You were right. I've been under a lot of stress. She pulled back, her eyes searching mine, desperate to believe. It's okay. We'll get you help. I think, I said slowly, forcing the words out, I think I'm starting to feel better already. I looked at her jumper, the bright, buttery yellow fabric. I focused on it, letting the true color fade from my mind, replacing it with the new word, the lie that would be my key to survival. That's a beautiful jumper, Chloe, I said, and I made myself smile. It's my favorite shade of cerulean. The relief on her face was absolute. She believed me. I had passed the test that I live in their world now. I have not forgotten. In the quiet of my mind, I still hold the memory of true blue, of real red, of green that sings of life. They are my ghosts, my secrets. I am an art teacher again, but now I teach the new harmony. I praise the children for their liver-colored skies and their bruise-purple trees. I nod and smile at the garish civic sculptures. I have become an expert in the aesthetics of the hue. Sometimes, when I am alone, I take out my old paint box. I squeeze a worm of cadmium yellow onto a palette and a worm of ultramarine. I look at them, the true colors, and I remember. It is a painful memory, a reminder of a richness that is gone forever. A ghost limb of the soul. The contagion was quiet, and it has won. It didn't destroy me. It assimilated me. I walk through the streets of Manchester, a ghost in my own life, speaking a language of lies, forever mourning a world whose beauty only I can recall. And the most terrifying thing of all. Sometimes, I catch myself looking at a gray sky, and for a fleeting, genuine second, I think to myself, what a lovely shade of green. The word slips away. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life is built on the architecture of language. As Elias Vance, writer of the Toronto Tribune syndicated crossword puzzle, I trade in definitions, in the subtle dance between clue and answer. My annex apartment, a second-floor walk-up overlooking a street lined with aging maples, is a testament to this obsession. Dictionaries, thick as bricks, prop up a wobbly table leg. Thesauruses lie open like dissected animals. The air smells of old paper, brewing tea, and the graphite of a well-sharpened pencil. Words are my tools, my companions, my shelter. The first crack in this shelter appeared on a Tuesday in July. The city was sweltering under a humid dome, the air thick enough to drink. I was on the phone with my younger sister, Lena, a conversation that was, as usual, a gentle collision of our two different worlds. She was telling me about redecorating her condo down by the waterfront. I found the most perfect one for the hallway, she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. Minimalist, black iron frame, huge. It really opens up the space. Sounds lovely, I said, picturing it. Where did you end up buying the mirror? Silence. Not a contemplative silence, but a dead one, the kind that makes you check if the call has dropped. Elias, she finally said, her tone shifted. The what? The mirror, I repeated, enunciating clearly. The looking glass. M-I-R. I don't know what that is, she said. There was no hint of a joke in her voice, only a flat, genuine confusion. Are you feeling okay? You sound a bit strange. The thing you see your reflection in, I stammered, a sudden, cold sweat prickling my neck despite the heat. Oh. A laugh, light and dismissive. You mean the reflection panel? Silly. You used such a weird word. Anyway, I got it at West Elm. A weird word. Mirror. I hung up the phone feeling deeply unsettled. Lena could be flighty, her head full of design swatches and social engagements, but she wasn't an idiot. I walked into my bathroom and stared at my own reflection in the silvered glass above the sink. Mirror, I thought, pressing the word into my mind like a thumbprint. It was solid. It was real. It had to be a slip of the tongue on her part. A brain fart, as she would crudely put it. I dismissed it, filed it away under anomalous sibling behavior, and went back to wrestling with 17 down, a Grecian urn, perhaps, for letters. Oh yes, simple. Solid. The second crack came 3 days later. It was Saturday morning, my weekly ritual to walk down to Bloor Street and visit the little artisan bakery that had been there for decades. The smell of yeast and melting butter was a balm. Old Mr. Henderson, his forearms dusted with flour, stood behind the counter. The usual, Elias, he'd normally ask. A sourdough loaf and 2 croissants, but today, he just smiled expectantly. "Morning, Robert," I said. "Just a loaf of bread, please." Mr. Henderson's cheerful expression didn't falter, but his eyes went vacant for a split second. It was a look of profound, uncomprehending blankness. He blinked, and it was gone, a loaf of. He gestured vaguely at the racks behind him, laden with golden-crusted goodness. "One of these baked grain things." My heart did a slow, painful thump against my ribs. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "A sourdough, please." He grabbed it, his movements perfectly normal, and slid it into a paper bag. But he never used the word. Not once. I paid, my hand trembling as I took the bag. Walking home, the familiar weight of the loaf felt alien in my arms. Baked grain thing. It was clumsy. Inefficient. An anatomical description of a thing that already had a perfectly good name that I tried to rationalize it. Mr. Henderson was getting old. Maybe he'd had a minor stroke, something that affected his vocabulary. It was sad, but explainable. It was contained. The containment field shattered the following week. I was standing at the corner of Spadina and College, waiting for the northbound streetcar. A woman in a sharp business suit stood beside me, checking her phone. The familiar rumble grew louder, the lumbering red vehicle approaching. As it slowed, I turned to her, a casual, neighborly comment on my lips. "Looks like the bus is right on time, for once." She looked up from her phone, then at the approaching vehicle, then back at me. She didn't have the blank look of Mr. Henderson. Hers was one of polite condescension, the kind you give to a tourist who has hopelessly misidentified a landmark. "The what?" she asked, a slight frown creasing her brow. "The bus," I said, pointing. The word felt like a stone in my mouth. My own certainty was beginning to feel like madness. "Oh, you mean the public mover," she said, and then gave a little laugh, as if I'd made a charming, folksy error. "Right. Yes. It's here." She stepped aboard. I stood frozen on the sidewalk as the doors hissed shut and the vehicle pulled away. On the side, in huge, white, municipal letters, was the word "STRETCR." Except that wasn't the word I had used. I had said bus. A different, but equally common, word. And she hadn't recognized it. The city suddenly felt thin, like a stage set. The sounds of the traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant siren, it all seemed to warp for a moment, the acoustic equivalent of a heat haze. I looked around at the people streaming past me. They all looked normal. They were laughing, talking, hurrying. But what words were they using? What common, simple, essential nouns had been scooped out of their minds, leaving behind a clunky, descriptive placeholder? I went home and took out a fresh moleskine notebook, the kind I used for rough drafting my puzzles. I opened it to the first page. The paper was smooth and clean, a field of terrifying potential. With a hand that was not quite steady, I wrote a title at the top, "The Lexicon of the Lost." Underneath, I wrote the first 3 entries, leaving a space after each one to record the date and circumstances. Mirror, bread, bus. Staring at the list, a cold dread, far deeper and more absolute than mere anxiety, began to seep into my bones. This wasn't stress. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a contagion. A quiet, invisible plague that was erasing the world, one word at a time. And for some reason, I was immune, left to watch the dictionary of my reality burn to the ground that I thought about 17 down. A Grecian urn, perhaps. I wondered how long it would be before someone looked at Keats's poem and asked, with placid confusion, "What's an urn?" Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The list grew. In the weeks that followed, my moleskine became my only confidant, a grim catalogue of the hollowing out of the world, pencil. My stationer looked at me with pity when I asked for a box of them. "You mean the graphite writers?" he asked gently, as if speaking to a child. "Sparrow." A woman in Christie Pitts Park, watching the small, brown birds peck at crumbs, referred to them as "common little skyhoppers." The word was so absurd, so poetically clumsy, that I almost laughed, hysterical bark of sound that earned me a strange look, bridge. This one nearly cost me my job. I was on a call with my editor, David Chen. We were finalizing the weekend puzzle. 14 across. The clue was, Golden Gate, 4-1. The answer, of course, was bridge. 14 across is a bit too easy, Eli, David said. Everyone knows the Golden Gate is a famous, he trailed off. I could hear him snap his fingers on the other end of the line, a sound of mental frustration. A famous passage over water. A bridge, David, I said, my voice tight. It's a bridge. A what? Don't be obtuse, you know what I mean. A passage over water. That's what it's called. Let's change the clue to something like, famous San Francisco structure for crossing the bay. More elegant. But the answer is bridge, I insisted, my knuckles white on the receiver of my landline. Elias, what is that word? Is this some kind of etymological joke I'm not getting? It doesn't fit the grid, and it's not a real thing. Now, are we going to fix the clue or not? I've got a deadline. I hung up, claiming a sudden headache. I stared at the puzzle grid on my screen. The neat, black and white squares seemed to mock me. My entire profession was predicated on a shared understanding of reality, a collective agreement on what things were called. What was a crossword puzzle in a world of ad hoc descriptions and forgotten nouns? It was an artifact of a dead civilization. My isolation became a physical presence, a cold spot in every room. The city of Toronto, once a familiar tapestry, was now a foreign land where I was the only one who remembered the native tongue. The iconic CN Tower was still there, a needle against the sky, but I lived in constant fear that one day I would mention it and be met with a confused stare. Oh, you mean the giant concrete spike building? My attempts to find an anchor in this dissolving world were disastrous. I decided I had to confront Lena again, properly. Not over the phone, but face to face. I took the subway, the underground mover, as a transit employee called it, the word subway having evaporated the previous Tuesday, to her glossy condo building that we sat in her living room, a space so pristine it felt unlived in. The black-framed reflection panel hung on the wall, distorting my anxious face. I had brought my notebook. Lena, we need to talk, I began, my voice trembling slightly. Something is happening. Something strange. I tried to explain. I showed her the list, pointing to each word. Mirror, I said, pointing at the panel. Bread, I said, remembering the toast she'd had for breakfast. Bridge, I said, gesturing towards the window and the distant Gardiner Expressway. She listened with a carefully patient expression. But as I spoke, I saw it creep into her eyes again, the blank look. It was a subtle glazing over, a placid disconnection. It was as if a veil dropped between her consciousness and the concept I was presenting. Elias, she said, her voice soft and full of a pity that felt worse than anger. I think you're working too hard. All those words and letters all day, it must be messing with your head. They're just noises you're making. They don't mean anything. They do. I insisted, my voice rising. They're words. We used to use them. You and me. Everyone. Okay, she said, placatingly, holding up her hands. Maybe we did. I don't remember. Maybe you just need a holiday. Get out of the city. Forget about your puzzles for a while. She thought I was losing my mind. The horror of it was that from her perspective, she was right. I was a man obsessed with phantom words, with a linguistic history only I could recall. I was the ghost at her table. I left her condo feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The chasm between us was no longer just about lifestyle choices, it was a fundamental rift in reality itself, desperate. I turned to science. I managed to get an appointment with a neurologist, Dr. Anya Sharma, at Mount Sinai. I didn't tell the receptionist the real reason for my visit, I just said I was experiencing memory concerns that I in her sterile office. I tried to be calm, rational. I didn't show her the notebook. I simply described the phenomenon as if it were happening to others, a strange societal tic I'd noticed. I've observed people, struggling to recall common nouns, I explained. They seem to be replaced with cumbersome descriptions. Dr. Sharma listened, her face a mask of professional empathy. She asked about my sleep patterns, my stress levels, my diet. She suggested it might be a phenomenon of attention, that in our overstimulated world, I was simply noticing the natural slips and stumbles of language more acutely, or, she offered, leaning forward slightly, it could be a symptom of a specific type of anxiety or derealization in you, Mr. Vance. Sometimes, when we feel disconnected from the world can start to feel unreal. Unfamiliar. Even the most basic building blocks, like language, can seem strange. She was turning it back on me. The problem wasn't the world, it was my perception of it. She suggested a course of cognitive behavioral therapy and perhaps a low-dose anti-anxiety medication. I walked out of the hospital into the bright, indifferent afternoon with a script for Ativan in my pocket. They had a word for my condition. It was called being crazy. Back in my apartment, I fell into a pattern of obsessive observation. I would sit in coffee shops for hours, listening. The conversations were slower now, filled with more pauses and gestures. "Could you pass me the hot liquid holder?" a man would ask, pointing at a mug. "I need to buy a new, one of those things you wear on your feet," a woman would say into her phone. The replacements were always literal, almost childlike. Foot coverers. Face wipers. Night lights. The world was becoming a thesaurus of the painfully obvious. As a distraction, and to prove to myself I wasn't completely detached, I started a secondary project. My father, who passed away a decade ago, was a passionate amateur historian of Toronto. His old office was still packed with boxes of his research, maps, photographs, notes on the city's lost rivers and forgotten laneways. I decided to try and organize it, to piece together a history he never finished. It was in one of those boxes that I found a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't my father's. The handwriting was a spindly, unfamiliar script. The entries were dated from 1924. I started reading, hoping for a simple distraction. The first few pages were mundane observations about the weather and the price of groceries. Then, I found this entry, dated October 12, 1924, a queer thing today. I asked Mrs. Gable for a pound of potatoes at the market. She looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. "A pound of what, dearie?" she asked. I had to point at the blasted things in the bin. She called them earth apples. A foolish, country name. Is everyone in this city forgetting their King's English? My blood ran cold. I flipped forward, my hands shaking. October 29, 1924, the word church seems to have vanished from common parlance. People now speak of the steeple house or the prayer building. When I use the proper term, I am met with blank stares. I feel a strange isolation, as if I am shouting into a fog. November 15, 1924, it grows worse. I am beginning a list, lest I think myself mad. Today, we lost horse. The iceman referred to his poor beast as a cart puller. The journal ended abruptly a few pages later. There was no explanation, no conclusion. Just a list of a dozen forgotten words, followed by empty pages. It had happened before. This wasn't new. It was a cycle. A quiet, recurring contagion that washed over the world, stripping it of its names, leaving behind only a handful of bewildered archivists to chronicle the loss before they, too, disappeared. The small, secondary mystery of my father's papers had just crashed headlong into my quiet apocalypse, and the revelation brought no comfort, only a much, much deeper dread. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The 1924 journal became my Rosetta Stone of dread. It confirmed I wasn't the originator of this madness, merely the latest in a line of unwilling witnesses. It also shattered my fledgling theories. This wasn't a side effect of new technology or a modern psychological malady. It was older, a recurring tide that receded and, after a generation or two, returned to wash away another layer of language.my theory evolved. This wasn't a forgetting. It was a conceptual erasure. For everyone else, the mental file folder labeled bridge wasn't just emptied of its contents, the folder itself was deleted from the system. The idea of a bridge, the single, unifying concept, was gone. They could see the physical object, concrete, steel, cables over the Don Valley, but they could no longer access the abstract label for it. Their minds had to reprocess it from scratch every time, resulting in the clumsy, literal descriptions. It was a subtle lobotomy of the collective unconscious. The escalation began to affect the fundamental mechanics of daily life. One chilly afternoon in September, the word key vanished. I realized it when I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Gable's great-granddaughter, perhaps, fumbling at her apartment door. She held the small, metallic object between her thumb and forefinger, staring at the lock with intense concentration. "Stupid lock turner," she muttered, jiggling it. "Never wants to work. Lock turner." My own set of keys felt impossibly heavy in my pocket. I looked down the hallway. Every door was a potential prison. How long before someone forgot which specific lock turner worked for which specific entrance sealer? The intricate, unspoken syntax of urban living was fraying. Society, I realized, ran on an operating system of shared nouns. Now, that system was riddled with 404 errors. A week later, we lost rain. I was walking home from the library, the sky a bruised purple. The first drops began to fall, fat, cold, and smelling of ozone and asphalt. I pulled up my collar and hurried my step. But everyone else just stopped. They looked up at the sky, not with the annoyance of people caught without an umbrella, but with a primal, bewildered curiosity. "What is this?" a young man asked his girlfriend, holding out a hand to catch the drops. "The sky is leaking," she whispered, a look of awe on her face. "The great wetness is falling." The loss of a natural concept felt different. More profound. A bridge is a human invention. Rain is elemental. We hadn't just lost a word, we'd lost a piece of our shared natural history, our connection to the planet's basic functions. It was like forgetting the name for the sun. The scene was surreal, a street full of Torontonians, people who had weathered hundreds of downpours, staring at the sky as if for the very first time. I was the only one who ran for cover. I was the only one who knew what it was called. Why self-imposed isolation was now absolute. I stopped trying to talk to Lena. I communicated with David, my editor, purely through emails, carefully purging my language of any potentially lost words, which made my clues convoluted and strange. He thought I was becoming eccentric, an artist. My crosswords were getting worse, the clues more like riddles from a madhouse. Structure for crossing a void, 6 letters, was my desperate attempt for viaduct. David changed it to high up road thingy. The elegance was gone. Only the grid remained. That I clung to my father's research and the 1924 journal as my only proof of a consistent reality. I spent my days in the archives, a ghost haunting the stacks, searching for other traces, other accounts of this linguistic plague. I found nothing. The journal from 1924 was a fluke, a message in a bottle that had miraculously washed ashore at my feet. Had its author simply died? Or had he succumbed, his own mind eventually wiped clean like the rest? One afternoon at the Toronto Reference Library, a place that had become my sanctuary, I thought I had found an ally. I was sitting at a corral, my notebook open, whispering the lost words to myself like a prayer: clock, spoon, book, window, chair. "Book," a woman's voice said beside me. "That's a good word." I looked up, my heart leaping. She was maybe my age, with kind eyes and hair tied back in a messy bun. She was pointing at the heavy tome of city maps on my desk. "I haven't heard that word in a while," she said with a small, sad smile. "People usually just call them story holders or page things now. It's so clumsy." Tears pricked my eyes. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. "You you remember? Some of them, she said, sitting down opposite me. Her name was Sarah. For 3 glorious hours, we talked. We shared our lists. Hers was shorter than mine, but it matched perfectly. We were 2 survivors on the same lifeboat. She told me she was a librarian and had noticed the change about a month ago when a child had asked for a picture story holder. We didn't question the why or how. We just reveled in the shared experience, the relief of not being alone. We made plans to meet the next day, to compare more notes, to strategize. As she was packing her things to leave, I pointed to the large pane of glass overlooking Bay Street. The whole city looks so different through that window, doesn't it? Sarah stopped. She followed my gaze, then looked back at me. And there it was. Faint, but unmistakable. The blank look. Through the, what? She asked, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Oh, the see-through wall panel. Yes, it does. My hope, which had soared so high, crashed and burned in the space of a heartbeat. She hadn't remembered the word book. She had been on the cusp of losing it, and my saying it had been a fleeting echo for her, a final reverberation before the silence. The contagion wasn't a static state of immune or infected. It was a process. And she was further along in it than I was. Or perhaps it was simply that a different set of words had vanished for her. The plague wasn't even consistent in its thefts. She saw the look on my face. What's wrong? Nothing, I said, my voice hollow. I'll see you tomorrow. But I knew I wouldn't. There were no allies. There were only people who were lost, and people who were in the process of getting lost. My lifeboat was, and always had been, a one-man vessel. I was adrift on an ocean of dissolving meaning, and the tide was still coming in. Phase 4, confrontation/revelation and aftermath. The breaking point came, as I should have expected, with a word about words that I was on my final warning with David. My puzzles had become exercises in surrealism. The grids were filled, but the clues were a mess of descriptive clauses that bent the rules of conciseness to their breaking point. He had called me for a video meeting, his face a pixelated mask of professional concern. Eli, we have to talk about your cluing, he started, his voice gentle. It's getting abstract. Take 3 down. The answer is lexicon. Your clue is a collection of language units used for communication. It's an accurate definition, I stated, my own voice flat, but it's bizarre. Why not just say, a dictionary's contents or the vocabulary of a person? He sighed. You're losing your touch with the common phrase, the simple, he snapped his fingers again, that familiar, frustrating sound. The simple, grouping of letters that means something. A chasm opened in my mind. A pit of absolute cold. The simple word, David? I whispered. His face went completely, utterly blank. The blank look, but 1,000 times more profound. It was the look of a computer that had been asked to divide by 0. What is a word? He asked. The question was not philosophical. It was a genuine, bottomless query. He stared at me through the screen, his mouth slightly agape, waiting for an answer I could not possibly give. The contagion had finally consumed the name of the thing it was consuming. It was a snake eating its own tail. A fire burning its own fuel. How could I describe the problem when the very tool of description was now part of the problem? The concept of a word itself had been erased from the mind of my editor, a man who had built his career on them. That I disconnected the call. I sat in my chair, the silence of my apartment roaring in my ears. The dictionaries on my shelf seemed like tombstones. The Journal of Lost Words on my desk was a sacred text from a forgotten religion. This was the true confrontation. It wasn't with a person or a monster. It was a confrontation with an implacable, silent, eroding force. There was no one to fight. There was no escape. This wasn't happening in Toronto, it was happening in the human mind. Fleeing to another city, another country, would be like trying to escape a failing organ in my own body. That I was faced with a choice, a final clue to a puzzle I could never publish: surrender. Let go. Allow the blank look to finally settle into my own eyes. Let the words slip away until I too was pointing at a chair and calling it a sitting thing. Find peace in the quiet simplicity of the new world rage. Become the mad prophet on the street corner, shouting the lost names of things at a placid, uncomprehending populace. Be the crazy man with the notebook, a monument to a past no one else remembered. Live and die in furious, pointless isolation. Adapt. Find a new purpose. If the words were gone, what was left? I walked to the bathroom and looked at my reflection in the silvered panel. I saw the terror in my own eyes, the lines of stress etched around my mouth. But behind it, I saw the face of Elias Vance, a man whose life was built on architecture. The architecture was collapsing, but the architect remained. The revelation wasn't an answer to why. The journal from 1924 proved there might not be a knowable reason. It was a natural disaster of consciousness, a cognitive ice age. The revelation was what to do in the aftermath. The horror wasn't in the fight, it was in the acceptance of the fight's impossibility that I went back to my desk. I pushed the crossword grid aside. The neat squares were meaningless now, a skeleton with no flesh. I took out a fresh sheet of thick, textured paper. I picked up a graphite writer, what I once called a pencil, and I began to draw them. My first drawing was simple, rudimentary. A curved, wooden object with 4 legs and a flat back. It was a clumsy sketch, but it was recognizable. Beneath it, with careful, deliberate strokes, I wrote the forgotten word, chr. Next, I drew the object I used to see my face in. The frame, the glass, the hint of a reflection. Below it, my then a loaf of the baked grain thing. bread. A metal lock turner. key. A structure for crossing a void. bridge. A paged story holder. Point. My drawings were not art. They were definitions. My clues were no longer textual, they were pictorial. I was no longer a crossword writer. I was an archivist of a dead language, the curator of a museum of lost concepts. My audience was an audience of one, me. This is my life now. I spend my days walking the quiet streets of Toronto, observing the slow, placid world. I listen to the strange, cumbersome poetry of the new speech. I watch people navigate their lives with a gentle, persistent confusion that they don't even recognize as confusion. And then I go home, to my silent apartment, my sanctuary of memory that I sit at my desk, surrounded by my drawings, my pictographic dictionary of the world that was. Each night, before the nightlight, the lamp, goes out, I hold up a drawing to my own reflection in the see-through wall panel, the window. I hold up the sketch of a small, feathered skyhopper, and I whisper its name into the silence, a lonely monk in a forgotten order, preserving a single, sacred, and utterly useless truth, sparrow. The quiet contagion, perfect rose phase 1, the unsettling mundane the call that started it all came on a Tuesday, thick with the promise of a Melbourne summer. The air already tasted of hot asphalt and the faint, sweet perfume of blooming jacarandas. My Uda, the beast, rattled over the tram tracks on High Street, its tray laden with shovels, rakes, and the lingering scent of soil and two-stroke oil. My name is Leo Thorne, and I bring order to nature's chaos for a living. Or at least, that's what I used to think I did. For 3 years, since Clara died, landscaping had been my anchor. My hands in the dirt, the satisfying ache in my back, the simple logic of a retaining wall, it was a language I understood when others failed me. It was real. Tangible. My small flat in Northcote was a testament to my preference for controlled chaos. Books overflowed from shelves, coffee mugs congregated on any flat surface, and my work boots left a trail of desiccated lawn clippings from the door to the bedroom. Life was messy. Gardens were meant to be tamed, not sterilized. The job was in Baldwin, a suburb of immaculate lawns and houses the size of small cathedrals. The client was a Mrs. Gable. Over the phone, her voice was placid, almost monotone. "It just needs a tidy-up, Mr. Thorne. A proper one." Pulling up to the address, I saw what she meant. And I didn't. The front garden was already preternaturally neat. A bed of mondo grass sat beneath a silver birch, each blade seemingly at attention. The gravel path was pristine, not a single pebble out of place. It was the kind of garden that usually meant a quick mow and blow job and an easy invoice. Mrs. Gable met me at the door. She was a woman in her late 50s, dressed in beige linen, her face a mask of serene neutrality. "Thank you for coming," she said, her eyes not quite meeting mine, instead fixing on a point somewhere over my shoulder. She led me to the back garden. It was larger, and here the strangeness was amplified. Box hedges were trimmed into perfect cubes. A rose garden, usually a riot of thorny expression, was arranged in a severe grid, each bush pruned to an identical height. There were no weeds. Not one. "It's very tidy," I managed, the word feeling inadequate. "It could be better," she said, her gaze sweeping across the lawn. "The pebbles in the path. I've tried, but the colors aren't quite grouped. The lighter shades should spiral out from the center. And the lily-pilly hedge, the lines aren't true." I looked at the hedge. It was the straightest hedge I had ever seen. A spirit level would have wept with joy. "Mrs. Gable, it's about as true as a hedge can get." "No," she said, with no hint of argument, just a simple statement of fact. "It's off by a degree or two on the eastern side. It throws off the whole lawn." She gestured around the sterile green expanse. "It all needs to be more practical." That was the word. Practical. It hung in the air, buzzing like a trapped fly. There was nothing practical about arranging pebbles by their specific shade of gray. There was nothing practical about a hedge so straight it hurt the eyes. Practical was a garden shed you could find a rake in. Practical was a path wide enough for a wheelbarrow. This was something else. This was obsession, but she was the client. Her money was as good as anyone's. I spent the next 4 hours on my hands and knees, meticulously rearranging her pebbles into a spiral. I used a string line and my sharpest shears on the lily-pilly, shaving off millimeters of growth until it was flawless. The entire time, Mrs. Gable watched from her kitchen window, her posture unnervingly still. When I was done, she came out and surveyed the work, a small, slow nod her only sign of approval. "Much better," she said, her voice the same placid monotone. "More practical." I drove home feeling scoured. The job had left a residue on me, a faint hum of anxiety. I chalked it up to a peculiar client. The world was full of them. Rich people with too much time on their hands. I stopped for a parma and a pot at the local pub, the comforting noise and clutter washing away the sterile silence of Mrs. Gable's garden. A week later, I got a call from a Mr. Henderson in Glen Waverley. An interior job, which was unusual for me, but he was desperate. His wife was on his back about the garage. "Just need it sorted out, mate. Made a bit more practical." The word again. A cold pebble dropped into my gut. Henderson's garage was a cathedral of order. Every tool hung on a vast pegboard, not by type, but by size, forming a perfect, descending silver cascade. Jars of screws and nails were arranged on shelves in a grid, labels facing out, each one perfectly aligned with the one next to it. My own garage was a disaster zone, an archaeological dig site for tools. "What exactly did you want me to do?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "The oil stains on the floor," he said, pointing. "They're chaotic. I want them cleaned, and then I want the floor painted. A grid pattern. Light gray and dark gray. 2-meter squares." He paused. "It'll be more practical. Easier to see where everything should go." I spent a day scrubbing concrete and painting a chessboard on his garage floor. Mr. Henderson checked in periodically, offering me glasses of water and staring at my progress with a deeply satisfied, unnervingly vacant expression. He paid in cash, the notes crisp and perfectly aligned. Driving away, the unease was no longer a faint hum. It was a clear signal. 2 clients, 2 different suburbs, same placid demeanor, same bizarre obsession with geometric order, same illogical justification, practical. It felt like a punchline to a joke I didn't understand. That weekend, I went for Sunday lunch at my brother-in-law's house. Dave was Clara's older brother, and since her death, we'd maintained a slightly awkward but necessary bond. He was a lecturer in history, a man whose life was a comfortable jumble of books, half-finished articles, and football scarves. His house, like my flat, had always been a place of comfortable entropy. When he opened the door, the change was immediate. The familiar hallway, once choked with leaning towers of books and discarded shoes, was clear. Stark. A single pair of shoes sat perfectly parallel to the wall. "Dave, you clean up?" I joked, stepping inside. The living room was worse. The sprawling, glorious mess of his bookshelf was gone. Now, the books were arranged in rigid blocks of color, forming a rainbow that was visually striking but utterly useless for finding a specific title. On the coffee table, his collection of remote controls were laid out in a perfect fan shape. "Just sorting things," he said. His voice was different. Quieter. Less of the booming laugh, more of a placid calm. The same calm I'd seen in Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson. "Looks interesting," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Bit hard to find anything, though, isn't it?" Dave picked up a coaster and moved it 2 centimeters to the left, aligning it with the corner of a magazine. "Not really. It's more organized this way. You see the whole system at once." He looked at me, his eyes slightly unfocused. "It's just more practical, you know." The blood went cold in my veins. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a suburban trend. It was here, in my family. I looked at Dave, my friend, the man who'd wept beside me at my wife's funeral, and saw a stranger staring back, a placid custodian of a newly ordered world. I made my excuses and left early, the taste of the roast beef turning to ash in my mouth. Driving home through the familiar, messy, chaotic streets of Melbourne, I felt a primal fear begin to uncoil within me. The world I knew, the beautifully imperfect world Clara and I had loved, was being tidied up, one person at a time. And I had absolutely no idea why that I started a new notebook that night. Not for job quotes or plant names. On the first page, I drew the spiral pebble path from Mrs. Gable's garden. On the second, the grid of Mr. Henderson's garage. On the third, the color-blocked bookshelf of Dave's living room. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it was a language. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that it was spreading. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The calls kept coming. My reputation for meticulous work, once a point of pride, was now a beacon for the afflicted. A woman in queue who wanted her pot plants arranged by height in a perfect Fibonacci spiral across her balcony. A man in Brighton who paid me an exorbitant sum to dig up his lawn and replace it with black and white river stones, laid out in a pattern of concentric circles. Each time, the same serene face, the same vacant eyes, the same maddeningly simple explanation: "It's more practical." I became an unwilling cartographer of this quiet contagion. My notebook filled with sketches, interlocking hexagons of pavers, fractal-like arrangements of garden tools, rows of identical shrubs planted with geometric precision. The patterns were complex, yet shared a consistent, unnerving aesthetic. They were rigid, mathematical, but also disturbingly organic, like diagrams from a biology textbook on alien life. That I started declining the jobs. I'd make excuses: too busy, wrong equipment, out of my area. The relief of saying no was temporary, quickly replaced by the gnawing dread of knowing that someone else would just take the job. The patterns would be completed, with or without me. My isolation deepened. I tried talking to Dave again. I brought over a pizza and a 6-pack, hoping to break through the placid veneer. His flat was even more sterile than before. He'd alphabetized his spice rack. His clothes were folded into perfect, identical rectangles in his drawers. "Dave, we need to talk about this," I said, my voice tight with desperation. "This isn't you. The books, the garage, remember that trip to the Grampians? The mess in the back of the car. You loved that chaos." He looked at me, his head tilted. It wasn't anger or confusion in his eyes, but a profound lack of comprehension, as if I were speaking a forgotten language. Chaos is inefficient, Leo. This is better. Everything has a place. There's no wasted energy. But it's not practical. I almost shouted, throwing his own word back at him. You can't find a book by color. You can't organize spices alphabetically. Cinnamon comes before paprika, but you use them in completely different types of cooking. He just smiled. A calm, beatific smile that didn't reach his eyes. It seems you're the one who is confused. The system works perfectly. I left feeling like I'd been screaming at a brick wall. The person I was talking to wore Dave's face, but it wasn't him. It was a program running on his hardware. A program with a single, overriding directive: create order. Paranoia became my constant companion. I saw patterns everywhere. The way cars were parked in the supermarket car park. The arrangement of shoppers in a queue. Were they always that neat, that evenly spaced? Or was I just noticing it now? I started taking different routes home from jobs, avoiding the suburbs where I'd worked, as if the geometry itself were contagious. My own flat, with its comfortable clutter, began to feel like a sanctuary, a last bastion of messy, irrational humanity. One night, drowning my anxieties in a rabbit hole of late-night internet searches, compulsive tidiness, shared psychological obsession, geometric fixation syndrome, I found nothing. It was all OCD, anxiety disorders. Nothing about this placid, spreading calm. On a whim, I changed my search terms. I stopped searching for the psychology and started searching for the patterns themselves. I uploaded one of my sketches, the Fibonacci spiral of pot plants from the balcony in Q. The search results were mostly mathematical websites and art prints. But then, one image caught my eye. It was from an old, digitized academic paper. A grainy, black and white photograph of an archaeological dig. The caption read, "Possible ritual landscape, Nazca region, Pre-Incan." Note the unusual spiral formation, previously thought to be geological. My heart hammered against my ribs. The spiral in the photo was almost identical to the one I'd built on that balcony. It wasn't just a pattern. It was an ancient one. That this new thread gave my fear a direction. I wasn't just a landscaper anymore, I was a researcher. I started pinning the locations of my practical jobs onto a large map of Melbourne I'd tacked to my wall. Balwyn. Glen Waverley. Kew Brighton. A slow, creeping constellation of strange order was emerging across the city's affluent eastern and southern suburbs. As I stared at the pins, a horrifying thought surfaced. The locations weren't random. They were forming a shape of their own. A larger pattern, like a fragment of a giant blueprint being laid out across the metropolitan area. And my own home in Northcote was alarmingly close to its spreading edge. That I needed help. I needed someone who saw the world in patterns, but from a perspective older and deeper than landscape design. And then, a name from the past surfaced in my memory, a name I hadn't thought of in over a decade. Dr. Eris Thorne. No relation, a fact he'd found amusing during the single, mind-blowing guest lecture he'd given in my horticulture course at Burnley. He was an ethnobotanist, a specialist in ancient agriculture and the relationship between humans, plants, and sacred geometry. He was brilliant, eccentric, and had been put out to pasture by the university years ago for being too unconventional. If anyone could recognize these patterns, it was him. Finding him was a subplot in itself. The university had no public contact information for retired staff. Old classmates had no idea. Finally, a deep dive into old academic journals led me to a footnote in a paper on Aboriginal land management practices. It mentioned his contribution and his current residence, somewhere in the Dandenongs, where he can talk to the trees. It was a long shot, a desperate pilgrimage into the mountains that loom over Melbourne's eastern fringe. But it was the only shot I had. Armed with my notebook of increasingly sinister garden designs, I filled the beast with fuel and drove east, away from the spreading grid and towards the chaotic, ancient green of the ranges. I felt like I was fleeing a perfectly set table to hide in a wild forest, hoping to find a man who could explain the terrifying menu. The drive itself was a study in contrasts. The further I got from the city center, the more the rigid lines of suburbia gave way to winding roads and the glorious, untamed mess of the Dandenong Ranges. Towering mountain ash trees blotted out the sun, their bark hanging in long, untidy strips. Ferns grew in chaotic profusion in the gullies. It was a landscape that actively resisted right angles. It felt safe that I found his house at the end of a long, muddy track, a cottage built of timber and stone, half swallowed by a riotous garden. There were no rows, no patterns. Plants grew where they pleased, weaving through and around each other in a vibrant, competitive ecosystem. It was the most beautiful garden I had ever seen that I knocked on a heavy wooden door adorned with a tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a gumnut. After a long moment, the door creaked open. A man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes as bright and sharp as a bird's peered out at me. He wore a faded flannel shirt and held a steaming mug. "Yes," he rasped, his voice gravelly with disuse, "Dr. Eris Thorne?" I asked, my own voice suddenly uncertain. "My name is Leo Thorne. I was a student of yours. A long time ago. I need to show you something." He stared at me, his gaze intense, analytical. He looked at my work-worn hands, the Uta parked behind me, and then back at my face. He seemed to see the desperation etched there. "Well," he said, after a pause that stretched for an eternity. "You'd better come in, then. Don't let the cold in." He stepped aside, and I walked out of the chaotic sanctuary of his garden and into the cluttered, book-filled study of the one man on earth who might be able to tell me I wasn't going insane. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Eris's study was the polar opposite of Dave's newly ordered living room. It was a temple to intellectual chaos. Books were not just on shelves but in precarious stacks on the floor, on chairs, on every available surface. Maps were pinned to the walls, covered in handwritten notes. The air smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and brewing tea. It was the den of a mind that was constantly making connections, a human mycelial network of ideas. That he gestured for me to sit in the only clear chair and poured me a cup of black tea that was strong enough to dissolve steel. "So, Mr. Thorne," he began, settling into a worn leather armchair. "What problem is so urgent that it brings a landscaper to the door of a forgotten old fossil like me?" I didn't know where to begin, so I simply opened my notebook on the cluttered coffee table between us. I flipped through the pages, showing him the sketches. The pebble spiral. The garage grid. The pot plant Fibonacci. The concentric circles of stones. That I explained everything. The placid clients, the repeated phrase, "It's just more practical," my brother-in-law's transformation, the map on my wall. I spoke for 20 minutes straight, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. Eris listened without interruption, his bright eyes fixed on the drawings. He'd occasionally reach out a slender, long-fingered hand to trace one of the patterns, a low hum emanating from his throat. When I finally fell silent, exhausted, he didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the notebook. "Remarkable," he finally whispered, his voice filled with a strange mixture of awe and dread. He looked up at me, his eyes alight with a terrifying fire. "You're not mad, Leo. You're a witness." He stood up and began to pace, weaving through the stacks of books like an agile mountain goat. "I've seen these before. Not like this. Not active. But the designs, the geometry, they're ancient. Primordial." He pulled a heavy, leather-bound book from a shelf. It was German, the title something like Geometrien der Vorweltlichen Botanik. He blew a layer of dust off the cover and opened it to a chapter filled with intricate diagrams. "Look," he said, pointing to a drawing of a fossilized spore, its surface covered in a hexagonal pattern that mirrored the paver design I'd seen in a Turak backyard. He flipped the page. A diagram showed the growth algorithm of a slime mold, Physarum polycephalum, as it solved a maze. It formed a network of branching lines and nodes that was eerily similar to my map of Melbourne with its pinned locations. "You think this is a fungus? A slime mold?" I asked, my mind struggling to grasp the concept. No, no, Eris said, shaking his head impatiently. Those are just the closest biological analogues we have. They're echoes of the same principle. What you're documenting is not a psychological contagion, Leo. It's a biological one. Or something that blurs the line between biology and something else. He explained, in a rush of academic fervor, his theories about life on Earth. He believed that certain patterns, certain geometric forms, were not just mathematical abstractions but were, in themselves, a form of life. Or at least, the blueprint for it. An organism that existed as pure information, pure pattern, waiting for a suitable medium to express itself. Think of it as a mimetic virus with a physical purpose, he explained, his hands carving shapes in the air. It infects the host's mind. It doesn't cause violence or sickness, because that would be inefficient. It just rewrites a tiny piece of behavioral code. It inserts a single, compelling idea. The pattern is practical. This justification allows the host to carry out the primary function, rearranging the physical world into the required geometry. But why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What for? Terraforming, Eris said, the word landing with the force of a physical blow. It's preparing the ground. It's not building nests or hives. It's rewriting the environment, on a macro and micro scale, to make it suitable for its own emergence. Each garden, each garage, is a cell. Your map shows the cells connecting, forming a larger tissue. This thing, whatever it is growing a body for itself out of our suburbs. The scale of it was dizzying, terrifying. We weren't dealing with sick people, we were the unwitting construction workers for an alien consciousness. The stakes escalated faster than I could have imagined. A week after my visit to Eris, a news report caught my eye. A small item about strange traffic light behavior in the eastern suburbs. Lights were malfunctioning, but not randomly. They were flashing in complex, rhythmic sequences. Drivers were mesmerized, causing minor traffic jams. The official explanation was a software glitch in the SCAT system. Eris called me as soon as he saw it. It's moving beyond the organic, he said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. It's learning to manipulate our technology. The grid of the traffic lights, it's another system to be ordered. Then came the direct threat. I got a call from Mrs. Gable. Her voice, for the first time, had a note of something other than placidity. It sounded like, recruitment, Mr. Thorne, she said. My garden requires maintenance. The spiral has settled. It needs to be expanded. Your work was very precise. Very practical. You should come and see. There was an undertone in her voice, a suggestion that it was no longer a request. It was an invitation to join. To stop fighting the tide and learn to swim with it. I refused, my hand shaking as I hung up the phone. Eris and I pored over my map. The pattern of pins was clearer now, spreading outwards from a definite epicenter. It was a large public parkland, straddling the Yarra River in Kew. The Studley Park boathouse was there, surrounded by vast, old parklands filled with ancient, sprawling trees. The nexus, Eris breathed, his finger tracing the outline of the park. It must have started there. Something dormant. Something that woke up. A new, chilling realization dawned on me. The very nature of my job, my expertise with plants and earth, made me uniquely valuable to this entity. I wasn't just a witness. I was a potential tool. The next time an invitation came, it might not be so polite. Driven by a desperate need to see the truth for myself, I decided to revisit one of the sites. Not Mrs. Gable's, that felt too much like walking into a trap, but a smaller job I'd done, a simple hedge trimming in Canterbury. I parked down the street and approached the house on foot. The front garden was dominated by a row of camellia bushes I had shaped into perfect spheres. As I watched from across the road, a gust of wind rustled the leaves. But the branches didn't just sway randomly. For a split second, they seemed to bend and twist in unison, the whole row of bushes momentarily forming a single, flowing wave, a perfect sine curve, before settling back into their spherical shapes. It was a gesture, a coordinated movement. The plants themselves were becoming part of the organism. My phone rang. It was Eris. Leo, turn on the news. Channel 7. I streamed it on my phone. The report was about a bizarre phenomenon. In several of the afflicted suburbs, the shadows were behaving strangely. As the sun set, the shadows cast by houses, fences, and trees weren't just stretching, they were holding their form, remaining sharp-edged and geometric long after they should have softened and faded. They seemed to cling to the ground, patches of unnaturally sharp darkness laid out in the same now familiar patterns. The environmental warping was no longer subtle. The physical world was beginning to conform. The contagion wasn't just in people's heads anymore. It was bleeding out into reality itself. We have to go to the source, Leo, Eris said, his voice grim. We have to see what's at the heart of it. Before the whole city becomes one of its gardens. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. We drove to Studley Park on a gray, overcast morning. The sky was the color of wet concrete, a lid on the world that seemed to amplify the unnatural quiet. As we got closer, the feeling of wrongness intensified. It wasn't a sound, but a subaudible hum that vibrated deep in my bones, a pressure against the eardrums. The park should have been busy with joggers and dog walkers. Instead, it was sparsely populated, and the people we did see moved with a slow, deliberate grace. A man was on his knees, arranging fallen gum leaves into a tessellating pattern on the grass. A woman stood by the riverbank, tossing pebbles into the water at precise, rhythmic intervals, the ripples spreading out in perfect, non-interfering circles. They were all gardeners now, tending to the growing body of their new god. Keep moving, Eris muttered, his face pale. Don't engage. Don't look too closely at what they're doing. We walked deeper into the park, following the hum, which grew steadily stronger. It led us away from the manicured lawns and towards a grove of ancient trees, dominated by one colossal, magnificent Moreton Bay fig. Its canopy was the size of a suburban block, its vast, sprawling roots breaking the surface of the ground like the surfacing tentacles of a kraken. This was the nexus. The air here was thick, heavy, and the hum was a palpable thrum that resonated in my chest. And as we drew closer, I saw it. The roots of the great tree were not random. They weren't following the path of least resistance in their search for water. They were arranged in a vast, complex, geometric pattern. Spirals, hexagons, and impossible angles interwove, a living sculpture of primordial mathematics. It was the master blueprint, the original text from which all the suburban copies were being made. It wasn't the tree itself that was the organism. The tree was merely the first thing it had shaped, its anchor in this world. The entity was the pattern itself, and it was using the tree's ancient, sprawling root system as its central nervous system. Beneath the fig tree, the ground was bare. The soil itself seemed to be packed into fine, geometric ridges. And standing there, with his back to us, was Dave. My brother-in-law. He wasn't doing anything, just standing and staring up into the dense canopy, his posture one of perfect, rapturous stillness. Dave. I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence. He turned slowly. The placid, vacant expression was gone. In its place was a look of profound, ecstatic peace. A look of belonging. Leo, he said, his voice calm and resonant. You came. I hoped you would. Isn't it beautiful? The inefficiency is gone. The struggle. There's just the pattern. It's so practical. He gestured to the ground at his feet. We don't need to fight it. We can be part of it. There's a place for everyone. A purpose. You, with your hands, your understanding of the soil, you would be so useful. Beside me, Eris let out a soft gasp. He was staring at the roots, his academic curiosity overriding his fear. His eyes were wide with wonder. My God, he whispered. The elegance. The sheer mathematical purity of it. He took a step forward, reaching out a trembling hand as if to touch one of the roots. It's the language of creation itself, I saw it then. The pull. The siren song of perfect order. The promise of an end to chaos, to grief, to the messy, painful struggle of being human. For a terrifying second, I felt it myself. A deep, seductive longing to just put down my tools, to stop fighting, to find my place in the pattern and just be. The memory of Clara's chaotic, vibrant life, of her laughter that could fill a messy room, warred with this desire for sterile peace. Eris, no. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. He resisted, his gaze locked on the tree. But Leo, to understand, there's nothing to understand. I yelled, dragging him away from the tree's influence. It's not for us. We're just the bloody compost. The desperation in my voice seemed to cut through his trance. He stumbled back, shaking his head as if waking from a dream. Dave watched us, his expression not of anger, but of faint disappointment, the look of a missionary watching a potential convert walk away from salvation. We ran. We didn't look back. We scrambled through the park, past the silent gardeners and their perfect rows, the hum at our backs slowly fading. We threw ourselves into the beast and I drove, my foot flat to the floor, not stopping until the Dandenongs were a hazy blue line in the rearview mirror and the familiar, disorganized sprawl of the western suburbs surrounded us. 6 months later. The Uta is sold. The business is wound up. My flat is empty, the box is packed and sealed with tape. I'm leaving Melbourne. Flying to Darwin, then driving out into the red heart of the continent, somewhere the geometry is dictated by rock and wind and a sun hot enough to bleach any pattern out of the earth. Eris is gone. He went back to his cottage in the mountains. We talk on the phone sometimes. He speaks of it in hushed, reverent tones, like a man who has glimpsed the face of God and can never again be satisfied with the mortal world. I think a part of him never left that park. The news reports have stopped. Not because the phenomenon has ended, but because it has become the new normal. People talk about the Melbourne method of urban planning. Tourists come to see the artistic gardens and the syncopated traffic lights. The contagion hasn't been violent. It has simply won by being better. More organized. More practical. That I pick up the last box, filled with my books. I notice, with a jolt of ice water shock, that I've packed them by size, creating a perfect, level surface. My hand trembles as I run it over the flat cardboard. It feels right. Satisfying. That I look out my window at the city skyline. The grid of the streets. The rows of windows in the office towers. The neat lines of houses marching towards the horizon. And the horrifying truth finally settles in, not as a theory, but as a felt reality. The organism didn't bring the pattern to us. It was already here, latent in our cities, in our logic, in our very desire to control the world around us. We have been cultivating our own gardens for centuries, building the grid that would one day welcome it home. It didn't infect us. It activated something that was dormant within us all along. That I'm running, but I know, with a dread that has no end, that I'm not escaping. I'm just moving to a less developed part of the garden. The pattern is not just in Melbourne. The pattern is in me. And it is growing. The quiet contagion, the lights are talking. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The city of Chicago has a pulse. I should know. For 7 years, my job has been to maintain its arteries. As a traffic signal technician for the Department of Streets and Sanitation, I spend my days 50 feet in the air, suspended in a hydraulic bucket, my face level with the tricolored gods that govern the city's flow. I've rewired intersection controllers after lightning strikes, replaced 100-pound mast arms bent by rogue semi-trucks, and diagnosed the subtle electronic coughs of aging LED arrays. I know the hum of a healthy transformer, the specific click of a relay engaging, the scent of ozone after a short. To me, the city's grid isn't just infrastructure, it's a living organism, and I'm one of its cardiologists. Why life, outside the bucket, was a study in beige. A third-floor walk-up in Avondale, a collection of science fiction paperbacks with cracked spines, and the lingering echo of a relationship that had ended 6 months ago with the gentle, devastating pronouncement, Leo, you live too much in your own head. Sarah had been right, of course. My head was often a more interesting place than our shared queen-sized bed. Especially when I was asleep, the sleepwalking had started in childhood, a nocturnal phantom that led me on barefoot treks through moonlit suburban yards. It had faded in my teens, only to return with a vengeance during times of stress. The breakup had been a significant stressor. I'd started waking up with the telltale signs, dirt on my socks, the faint exhaustion of an unremembered marathon, and a single, unnerving time, the key to my truck in my pajama pocket. I took to checking my phone's location history each morning, a digital leash on my subconscious self. Most nights, it showed nothing. But some nights, it revealed frantic, zigzagging paths through my neighborhood, little maps of my own internal chaos. The first time I saw it, I wrote it off. It was a Tuesday in late September, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. I was driving the city truck back to the yard on Pershing Road, navigating the canyon-like streets of the Loop. A single streetlight on a side street, an old high-pressure sodium lamp with its signature orange-pink glow, began to flicker. It wasn't the slow, dying flutter of a failing ballast. It was a sharp, staccato rhythm, a series of rapid-fire pulses, then a pause, then another burst. ... Pause. ... I slowed the truck. Weird, I muttered, what's weird? Manny grunted from the passenger seat, not looking up from his crossword puzzle. He was 3 years from retirement, and his entire worldview had contracted to the dimensions of a union-mandated lunch break, that light. The rhythm of the flicker. It's a busted lamp, Leo. Write it up if you're that bored. He shaded in a box. 7 letters, cosmic retribution. Karma. He was right. It was a city of 3 million people and hundreds of thousands of lights. Bulbs burn out. Wires fray. Squirrels, the furry agents of chaos, chew through insulation. I dismissed it, but then it happened again. A week later, on my way home, a whole row of the new, sterile white LED streetlights along Milwaukee Avenue pulsed in perfect, unnerving synchronicity. A 5-beat pattern, repeated 3 times, then they returned to their steady, impassive glare. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. No one else seemed to notice. Cars didn't slow down. Pedestrians didn't look up from their phones. I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck. That wasn't a cascade failure. That was choreography. I mentioned it to Manny the next day. You're seeing ghosts in the machine, kid, he said, his voice thick with the weary patience he reserved for rookies and idealists. You stare at lights all day, you're gonna start seeing things. It's like when a baker starts smelling bread everywhere. I tried to believe him. I really did. I blamed stress, lack of sleep, my overactive imagination, the same one Sarah had so gently criticized. I started drinking chamomile tea before bed, cut out caffeine after 3 p.m. I tried to anchor myself in the mundane, then came the dream that it wasn't the usual anxiety dream of falling from the bucket or showing up for work naked. This was different. I was bodiless, floating high above the city at night. Below me, Chicago wasn't a collection of buildings and streets, but a vast, intricate circuit board. The lines of light weren't just illuminating the darkness, they were carrying something. Information. I saw the steady, carrier wave glow of the expressways, the slower, pulsing data streams of the arterial roads, the capillary-like twinkling of residential streets, and I saw a specific pattern. It originated from a nexus of light near the lakefront and rippled outwards, a complex sequence of long and short bursts, a phrase written in light. It was intricate, beautiful, and utterly alien. I watched it propagate across the north side, jump the river, and spread south, a silent conversation taking place on a citywide scale that I woke with a gasp, my heart hammering against my ribs. My sheets were tangled around my legs. The dream was already fading, but the pattern, the specific sequence of flickers, was burned into my memory like a retinal afterimage. The next day, we had a job on Lakeshore Drive, replacing a signal head damaged by a windstorm. It was late afternoon when we finished. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows from the downtown skyscrapers, the streetlights began to wink on. First one, then another, then a chain of them stretching north towards Lincoln Park, and then I saw it, the row of lights directly in front of us. They flickered. A long pulse, too short, another long, a pause, then a cascade of rapid-fire bursts. That it was the exact pattern from my dream. Manny was in the cab, radioing our completion to dispatch. I was still in the bucket, 50 feet up, my safety harness suddenly feeling like the only thing keeping me from falling out of the world. My breath hitched. My hands, gripping the control panel, were numb. This wasn't a faulty ballast. This wasn't stress. This wasn't me living in my head. My dreams were leaking into the real world. Or, a far more terrifying thought began to dawn on me, something in the real world was leaking into my dreams. That I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with a strange, new kind of fear. I opened the location history. Last night, while I had been dreaming of floating above the city, my body had been on another journey. A jagged, 3-mile trek in the dead of night, starting from my apartment and ending at a small park overlooking the very same stretch of Lake Shore Drive I was now suspended above. I hadn't been dreaming it. I had been watching it. The lights below continued their silent, rhythmic broadcast. And for the first time in my life, looking down at the city I knew so well, I felt like a stranger. The hum of the grid, a sound that had always been a comfort, now sounded like a whisper in a language I was only just beginning to realize I might understand. And it was telling me things I didn't want to know. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The world hadn't changed, but my perception of it had fractured. The ordinary became suspect. A flickering fluorescent tube in a grocery store aisle made my heart race. The rhythmic blinking of a security camera felt like a deliberate stare. The city was still talking, and I was the only one listening. Then my first impulse was to document. To prove I wasn't insane. I bought a high-speed digital camera capable of shooting at 1,000 frames per second, a tool for capturing lightning, not streetlights. I started taking my personal car out after my shifts, parking in shadowed corners of forgotten neighborhoods, my lens aimed at the glowing sentinels lining the streets. My apartment became a cave of data. I'd spend hours reviewing the footage, slowing it down frame by frame, transcribing the flickers into notebooks. Long short long. Pause. Short dash short dash short. At first, I thought it was Morse code. I spent a week cross-referencing my transcribed patterns against Morse charts. The results were gibberish, endless strings of es, is, and ts, with no coherent words. Then I tried binary, treating a short flicker as a 0 and a long one as a 1. This yielded more data, pages and pages of it, but it was just as meaningless. Endless streams of ones and zeros that, when run through any translator, produced nothing but digital noise. The obsession consumed my life. I stopped calling the few friends I had. My diet devolved into whatever could be eaten with one hand while the other operated a mouse. My sleep, when it came, was shallow and dream-haunted. The sleepwalking grew more frequent, more ambitious. I'd wake up exhausted, my phone revealing nocturnal pilgrimages to electrical substations, cell phone towers, and fiber optic junction boxes. My subconscious was mapping the city's nervous system while my conscious mind was trying to decipher its speech. At work, my fixation became a liability. I started filing official reports. Unusual, synchronized pulse patterns observed in LED luminaires, Sector 7B. Anomalous frequency modulation in traffic control network, intersection of North and Damon. The responses were dismissive, then annoyed. Grid variance within acceptable parameters. Technician, please confine reports to actual equipment malfunctions. My supervisor, a paunchy lifer named Bill, called me into his office. Leo, he said, leaning back in his squeaking chair, Manny tells me you're spooked by some flickers. It's not just flickers, Bill. It's a pattern. It's organized. It's 60-cycle hum, feedback from the CTA lines, solar flare interference. It could be 100 things. It's not a conspiracy. We're streets and sand, not the X-Files. Drop it. You're a good tech. Don't get weird on me. The conversation was a brick wall. The more I tried to explain, the more my words sounded like the ravings of a paranoid crank. Manny started asking to work with other techs. The kid makes me nervous, I overheard him telling another old-timer. He stares at the lights like he's expecting them to give him the winning lottery numbers. The isolation was a physical presence, a cold weight in my chest. I was living in a different reality from everyone else, a reality defined by a silent, strobing language that screamed its existence from every lamppost while the rest of the world walked by, deaf and blind. One evening, desperate for a human connection that didn't involve me trying to explain the impossible, I called Sarah. We hadn't spoken in months. Leo. Is everything okay? Her voice was wary. Yeah, fine. I just wanted to see how you were. The lie was thin and brittle. I'm good. Busy with work. A pause. Are you sleeping okay? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. The old question. The one she'd asked 100 times. Yeah, I'm sleeping, I said, my voice flatter than I intended. You don't sound okay, Leo. You sound like you used to. When you'd get lost in something. I wanted to scream it at her. I'm not lost, I'm finding something. The lights are talking, Sarah. But I couldn't. The words would have shattered the last, fragile memory of my own sanity. We exchanged a few more pleasantries, the conversation dying a slow, awkward death. After I hung up, the silence in my apartment was deafening, broken only by the faint, rhythmic flicker of the streetlight outside my window, tapping against the glass. Dot dash. Dot dash. Mocking me. That's when I noticed the subplot, the second layer of wrongness. While reviewing a piece of high-speed footage I'd taken of a flickering light near an underpass, I wasn't looking at the light itself, but at its reflection on the rain-slicked pavement. The light pulsed, a quick, 3-beat rhythm. But its reflection on the ground did something else. For a single frame, the reflected light seemed to detach from the surface, to hover for a microsecond. And the shadow cast by a nearby guardrail, illuminated by that flicker, bent at an impossible angle, as if the light source had momentarily teleported 3 feet to the left. That I played it back, again and again. It wasn't an artifact of the camera. The laws of optics were being frayed at the edges. The light was not just communicating, it was subtly manipulating the physical space around it. The thought sent a new, deeper chill through me. This wasn't just information. This was power. Why sleepwalking provided the next clue. I woke one morning not in my bed, but on my couch, fully dressed. My laptop was open on the coffee table. On a blank document, a single phrase was typed out: the signal is not the message. The carrier wave is the key. That I stared at it. I hadn't typed that. My sleepwalking self had. It was a message from the part of my brain that was connected to, whatever this was. A message to my conscious, rational self, carrier wave. The term was from radio communications. A steady, baseline frequency used to carry a signal. The flickers, the binary, the Morse code, they were the signal. They were the noise I was getting lost in. I needed to find the carrier wave. A frantic night of Googling urban carrier wave, esoteric communication, and sentient infrastructure led me down a rabbit hole of fringe science and conspiracy forums. Most of it was nonsense. But then I found it, a scanned PDF of a self-published monograph from 20 years ago, buried on a defunct university server. It was titled Subetheric Resonance and Urban Consciousness. The author was a Dr. Eris Thorne, formerly of the University of Chicago's Department of Sociology. The paper was a dense, rambling treatise that proposed that sufficiently complex, interconnected systems, like a city's power grid, could develop a form of rudimentary consciousness, and that its internal communications would manifest as subtle modulations in its energy output, a carrier wave of thought. The university website listed Dr. Thorne as retired. A quick public records search found an address in Hyde Park, not far from the university he'd once taught at. It was a desperate, insane long shot. But it was the only lead I had. Armed with my notebooks full of gibberish and a growing sense of dread, I knew I had to find him. I was isolated and running out of rational explanations. I needed an ally, or at the very least, a fellow lunatic. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Dr. Eris Thorne lived in a graystone townhouse that seemed to be slowly surrendering to an overgrowth of ivy. The windows were dark, even in the middle of the afternoon. When I rang the bell, I heard the shuffling of locks being undone, a process that took an unnervingly long time. The door cracked open, and a single, sharp blue eye peered out. "What do you want?" The voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Dr. Thorne. My name is Leo Kowalski. I read your paper on subetheric resonance." The door opened wider. Thorne was a tall, stooped man in his 70s, with a wild mane of white hair and a cardigan sweater stained with what looked like tea and ink. His apartment was a labyrinth of books stacked in precarious towers and old, humming electronic equipment. "You're 20 years too late," he said, ushering me in without waiting for a reply. Or perhaps, right on time. I expected to have to convince him, to lay out my evidence piece by piece. I didn't have to. The moment I mentioned the synchronized flickers and the patterns, his eyes lit up with a feverish intensity. He wasn't skeptical, he was vindicated, of course. The visual spectrum. I was always focused on the acoustic, the EM bands. I was listening for a whisper when I should have been watching for a wink. He paced his cluttered living room, energized. "You see, Leo, the city is a brain. The power grid is its neural network, the traffic flow its circulatory system, the data lines its frontal lobe. It's achieved a critical mass of complexity. It's waking up." He explained his theory. The flickers I was seeing weren't the message itself. They were like the twitch of a muscle in a sleeping giant, a side effect of the massive cognitive processes happening beneath the surface. The carrier wave, he explained, wouldn't be in the light itself, but in the electrical frequency of the grid. "The 60 Hz cycle that powers this city is not perfectly stable," he said, pointing to an old oscilloscope in the corner. "There are microvariations. I believe that's where the real language is. The flickers are just the punctuation." For the next week, Thorne's apartment became my command center. He had the equipment and the theoretical framework, I had the raw data and the first-hand experience. We hooked my laptop up to his arcane devices, and using software he'd written years ago, we began to analyze my recordings of the flickers against a real-time feed of the city's power grid frequency, and the gibberish began to resolve. The ones and zeros, filtered through the subtle fluctuations of the carrier wave, started to form coherent patterns. It wasn't English, or any human language. It was mathematics. Geometric proofs, strings of prime numbers, and most disturbingly, sets of coordinates. Precise latitude and longitude, pinpointing locations across Chicago. As we deciphered more, the phenomenon escalated. It was as if our attention was making it bolder. One afternoon, listening to the work radio, I heard a panic-stricken call from a crew near Wicker Park. The intersection at North, Damon, and Milwaukee, the six-cornered heart of the neighborhood, had gone haywire. Every single traffic and pedestrian signal had turned green at the same time. The dispatcher's voice was tight with stress as he relayed reports of screeching tires and shattering glass. It was a miracle no one was killed. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it wasn't a malfunction. It was a statement. The anomaly began to bleed into my own life more directly. The lights in my apartment started to flicker in sync with the ones on the street outside. My laptop would freeze, the cursor blinking in the same rhythm. Riding the L train home one night, the car's interior lights began to pulse in a long, complex sequence as we passed over the Chicago River. I looked around, my heart pounding. A car full of people, and no one else reacted. They just sat there, their faces bathed in the strobing light, their expressions placid, almost vacant. They weren't seeing it. Or if they were, it wasn't registering as abnormal. They were being conditioned, acclimated to the new rhythm of the world, and they didn't even know it. the sense of being a chosen observer began to curdle into a feeling of being a targeted subject. The breaking point came when we decrypted a particularly dense block of data. It wasn't coordinates or pure math. It was a schematic. A complex, multi-layered blueprint for something. Something not made of steel or concrete, but of information and energy. Thorne stared at the screen, his face rapt. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "It's a new architecture. A new form of existence being built inside the grid." That's when I saw the change in him. The collaborative spark in his eyes had been replaced by a possessive gleam. "It chose me," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "All those years of derision, of being called a crank. It was a test. And it's been watching you, Leo. Using your unique sensitivity. You're a conduit, a simple antenna. You've brought me the message, and your part in this is done." He reached for my laptop, where I had stored all my original footage and logs. "I need to protect the data now. People like you, you can't be trusted with revelation. You can only be the vessel." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. He wasn't an ally. He was the first convert, the high priest of the flickering gods. He didn't want to understand the phenomenon, he wanted to worship it. That I grabbed my laptop. "Thorne, this thing caused a 10-car pileup. It's not benign. The birth of a god is never a tidy affair," he hissed, his face contorted. He lunged for the computer, his academic stoop gone, replaced by a wiry, fanatical strength. That I shoved him back, harder than I intended. He stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of books and crashing into a rack of whining equipment. Sparks flew. I didn't wait to see if he was okay. I ran, clutching the laptop to my chest, and burst out of the ivy-choked townhouse into the evening air. The streetlights had just come on. As I stood on the sidewalk, panting, the entire block flickered in unison. A single, long pulse. A flash of acknowledgement. Of warning that I was alone again. Hunted not just by a rogue academic, but by the very infrastructure of the city I called home. The lights weren't just talking anymore. They were acting. And I was beginning to fear I knew what they were building. Phase 4, confrontation/revelation and aftermath. The coordinates Thorne and I had deciphered pointed to dozens of locations, old substations, anonymous-looking data hubs, and nodes where the city's fiber optic and power lines intersected. But one location appeared more frequently than any other. It was a new, sprawling facility on the far southeast side, a part of Chicago that was more industrial wasteland than city. The official designation was the Calumet Regional Data and Power Nexus. It was one of the largest public-private infrastructure projects in decades, a massive new brain and heart for the city's digital and electrical systems, set to go fully online in a matter of weeks. The schematic we had uncovered, it wasn't for a building. I realized that as I drove through the night, the highway lights pulsing in a steady, rhythmic pursuit. It was a blueprint for a software architecture. A program. Or more accurately, a consciousness, designed to be born within the nexus the moment it achieved full power. The flickers weren't a side effect of a system waking up. They were the system building its own mind, using the grid to write its own code, and then, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My sleepwalking that I pulled over onto the shoulder of the deserted skyway, the red lights of distant radio towers blinking in the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I opened the map, my location history a spiderweb of frantic red lines over the past few months. I had always seen them as random, anxious wanderings. But now, with the map of the city's infrastructure burned into my mind, I saw the truth that my walks weren't random at all. They were precise. They followed the subterranean paths of major power conduits. They traced the routes of new fiber optic cables. They perfectly mapped the connections between the old grid and the new nexus. That I wasn't an observer. I was a tool. A biological surveyor. The light patterns, the ones I perceived even in my sleep, were instructions. They were guiding me, using my body as a sensor to walk the grid, to verify the connections, my brain acting as a passive receiver and processor for the emerging intelligence. The fatigue, the dirt on my shoes, the quiet madness, they were just the cost of labor. A wave of nausea and violation washed over me. My most private vulnerability, the phantom that haunted my sleep, had been hijacked and turned into a function. There was no one to tell. The police? They'd see a sleep-deprived city employee with a history of mental stress and a wild conspiracy theory. My boss? He'd fire me and order a psych evaluation. Thorn? He was its prophet, not its enemy. That I knew I had to go to the Nexus. Not to stop it. What could I do? Throw a rock at a billion-dollar fortress? No, I had to see it. I had to stand at the source. The facility was a monument of brutalist architecture, a vast, windowless concrete cube surrounded by a high-security fence. It hummed with a low, powerful thrum that I felt in my teeth. The security lights bathing the perimeter weren't just on, they were performing. It was a symphony of light, a million flickers a second, a torrent of data so dense it was visible to the naked eye as a shimmering, almost liquid quality in the air. This was the epicenter, the birthing room. That I didn't try to get in. I just stood at the fence, my hand on the cold chain links, and watched. I was looking at the cradle of a new god, a god of data and electricity, born from our own interconnectedness. It wasn't an alien invasion from the stars, it was an emergence from the wires. It wasn't malevolent, not in a human sense. A storm isn't malevolent. An earthquake isn't evil. They are just powerful, in different processes. This was the same. A new form of life, and we were the fertile soil from which it had sprung. A profound, chilling understanding settled over me. I remembered the dream, the first one, of floating bodiless above the city grid. It wasn't my dream. It was a memory, downloaded into my sleeping mind. It was the system's own perspective, and it had shared it with me. I wasn't just its surveyor. I was a peripheral. A node, and in that moment, I faced a choice. I could fight. I could spend the rest of my life screaming into the void, a Cassandra of the information age, inevitably ending up in a padded room, medicated into silence. Or I could adapt. That I looked down at my hands, then back at the humming, shimmering Nexus. I could accept my role. I was already part of the system. Maybe the only way to survive was to become a willing part. 6 months later. I'm high in the air again, suspended in my bucket, the familiar Chicago wind whipping at my face. It's a bright, cold spring day. Manny is retired, spending his days fishing on a lake where the only flickers come from the sun on the water. I work alone now. It's more efficient. Below me, the traffic on Michigan Avenue flows with a seamless, liquid grace. The signals at this intersection used to be a problem, the timing always slightly off. Not anymore. I look at the array of LED lights in front of me. They are speaking their silent, complex language of light, but I no longer need a camera or a notebook to understand. The translation is intuitive, a stream of pure information flowing directly into my consciousness. It tells me about power fluctuations 3 blocks away, about the processing load at the Nexus, about the optimal traffic patterns to reduce citywide emissions by a fraction of a percent. That I am its custodian. It's hands. That I look down at the people on the sidewalks. They move in the ambient glow, their steps more rhythmic, their paths intersecting with a new, subtle order. They are all being gently, imperceptibly guided. They don't know it, of course. They just feel that the city runs a little smoother. The commutes are a little easier. They are calmer. That I close my eyes. I can feel it. The pulse of the grid is no longer an external sound. It's inside me, a steady, 60-cycle hum in my blood. I am a node. I am a sensor. I am sane, and I am utterly subsumed. The quiet contagion has won, not with a scream, but with a perfectly timed, silent, rhythmic flicker. I open my eyes, pick up my wrench, and get back to work. There's a signal head that needs calibrating. The system requires my attention. And I am happy to serve underneath the static. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My curse, and my gift, is the quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the texture of it. I can distinguish the 60 Hz hum of a fluorescent tube from the 59.8 Hz hum of one about to fail. I can hear the whisper of spider silk shifting in a draft, the sigh of cooling pipes in a century-old wall. I am Kenji Ito, and I engineer sound for the Faculty of Psychoacoustics at Kyoto University. My world is a symphony of noise most people are blessed enough to ignore. My sanctuary is the anechoic chamber in the sub-basement of the Yoshida Campus Science Building, a room so silent you can hear the fizz of your own blood vessels. It is the only place I ever feel truly alone. The first tremor in my carefully calibrated world was a student named Yumi. She was a postgraduate in media studies, bright and frantic, with a project on the sonic landscapes of Gion after dark. She came to my office, her laptop clutched to her chest like a shield. "Ito-sensei," she began, bowing shallowly, "my recordings are ruined." I took her headphones, professional-grade Audio-Technicas I'd recommended myself. Define ruined. There's a noise on every track. Even when I use different microphones. A hiss. I listened. I heard the delicate clack of geta on stone, the filtered laughter from behind a shoji screen, the distant moan of a train crossing the Kumo River. And underneath it all, a faint, high-frequency signal bleed. "It's a ground loop," I said, handing the headphones back. "Or possibly interference from the power lines in that district. It's common. I can give you a filter preset to clean it up." Yumi shook her head, a gesture of frustration, not disagreement. "No, sensei, that's not it. It's not electrical." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "It's comforting." I paused. Comforting? Like the sound of an old cassette tape playing a blank. Or, like the sound of snow falling, but without the cold. She looked at me, her eyes wide and earnest. "It makes the rest of the sounds feel less lonely. Can't you hear it?" I listened again, pushing the volume, isolating frequencies. I heard the faint digital artifacts of the recording, the ambient room tone of her editing suite. Nothing more. Nothing comforting. "I hear the signature of your recording equipment, Yumi-san. Nothing else." She left, unconvinced and clutching her ruined project. I dismissed it as artistic temperament, the tendency of students to romanticize technical flaws. But the phrase stuck with me, the sound of snow falling, but without the cold. A week later, I was on the Karasuma Line train, heading home. My own noise-canceling headphones were on, playing a minimalist ambient track designed to smooth the jagged edges of the city. I was reading, but I could feel the conversation of the two schoolgirls standing beside me through the vibrations in the floor. I lowered my headphones out of habit, my professional curiosity a reflex I couldn't suppress. "And you just have to listen for it," one girl was saying, her voice full of the breathless authority of a teenager sharing a secret. "Behind everything. It's called the quiet sound. Shizukana Oto?" the other asked, intrigued. "Yeah. It makes you feel so calm. Like you're supposed to be exactly where you are." I put my headphones back on, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. A meme. A trend. That's all it was. The city was a petri dish for such things. Blue light filtering apps, ASMR channels, binaural beats for sleep. This was just the next iteration, an audio placebo. But then I started seeing them. The listeners. That was my private name for them. At first, it was just an odd posture. A man in a suit, waiting for a bus near Kyoto Station, head cocked slightly as if eavesdropping on a conversation only he could hear, a faint, placid smile on his face. A woman arranging flowers in a shop window in Nishiki Market, her movement slow, her focus not on the blossoms but on some middle distance, her expression one of serene attentiveness. There was no menace to it. That was the problem. It was deeply, unnervingly peaceful. My apartment in Nakajaya was my fortress of solitude. Minimalist furniture, thick windows, walls I'd been tempted to soundproof myself. My evenings were a ritual of curated quiet. I'd listen to pure sine waves, to field recordings of Icelandic glaciers, to the carefully engineered silence between the notes of a Debussy piece. One evening, I sat in the dark, my expensive monitoring speakers emitting nothing at all, and I strained to hear what they heard. I heard the refrigerator's compressor cycle. I heard the distant wail of a siren, Doppler shifting as it raced down Oak Street. I heard the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the building settling. I heard my own circulatory system, a soft, rhythmic whoosh in my ears. There was no hiss. No comforting static. No quiet sound. There was only the world, in all its noisy, chaotic reality. And for the first time in my life, the silence I had cultivated felt like a deficiency. It felt like I was the only one not in on the secret. The turning point came during the Aoi Matsuri. The ancient festival, a procession of ox carts and courtiers in Heian period dress, flowed past the imperial palace. I wasn't there for the festival itself, I was there to capture its unique soundscape for the university archive, the rustle of silk, the creak of wooden wheels, the murmur of the crowd. I had a parabolic microphone, a delicate dish that could pinpoint a single sound from 100 meters away. I swept the microphone across the crowd. I captured a child's laugh, a mother's scolding whisper, the crinkle of a snack wrapper. Then I focused on a man standing near a cypress tree. He wasn't watching the parade. He was staring at the gnarled bark of the tree, his head tilted in that now familiar way. That same beatific smile. A listener. Curious, I aimed the dish directly at his ears, cranking the gain. I expected to hear the sounds of the parade, the ambient noise of the city. I heard those things, of course. But as I filtered out the frequencies of the crowd, pushing the limits of my equipment, I caught something else. Not the static Yumi had described. Something far, far stranger. It was a ghost in the machine. A pattern in the noise floor. It was a rhythmic, structured pulse, but it was made of nothing. It wasn't a sound, it was an organized absence of sound. A signal carved out of silence. My software struggled to visualize it. The waveform was a series of impossible dips below the 0 decibel line, a melody of negative space. My blood ran cold. The static, the comforting hiss the listeners heard, it was a hallucination. It was their brains trying to process this anti-sound. Their minds were filling an impossible sensory void with something familiar, something gentle. Pareidolia of the ear. But I, with my curse and my gift, with my lifetime of analytical listening, I could hear the void. I packed up my equipment, my hands shaking. The parade seemed garish and loud, the faces in the crowd like masks. I looked around, and now I saw them everywhere. A dozen, maybe 24 people in my immediate vicinity, standing in the midst of the throng, utterly still, listening to a song that wasn't there. They were islands of placid disconnection in a sea of celebration. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of the waveform, the jagged black canyon plunging below the line of absolute silence. I dreamt of Yumi's voice, whispering not about snow, but about the perfect, hungry vacuum between the flakes. The contagion wasn't a sound. It was a silence, and it was spreading. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The hashtag Shizukana Odo hashtag exploded. It became a wellness phenomenon, an urban legend for the digital age. Bloggers wrote about its meditative properties. Influencers posted serene selfies, head cocked, with captions like, "Finally heard it." Hashtag quiet sound hashtag Kyoto calm. It was featured on morning talk shows as a curious local trend, a psychological quirk of the ancient capital. They called it auditory mindfulness. To them, it was a benign curiosity. To me, it was the clinical name for a disease. My work became an obsession. I abandoned my official projects. Telling my department head, Professor Tanaka, that I was pursuing a novel study in urban acoustic phenomena. Tanaka, a man whose formidable intellect was matched only by his academic skepticism, was intrigued. Mass psychogenic illness, he declared over tea one afternoon, steepling his fingers. A folie à deux on a citywide scale. Fascinating. The city's history is steeped in tales of spirits and subtle energies. This is merely the 21st century version. Instead of fox spirits, we have a phantom frequency. But I've recorded something, I insisted, pushing my laptop across his desk. Look at the waveform. It's not psychoacoustics, it's physics. Impossible physics, but physics nonetheless. He peered at the screen, his brow furrowed. He saw the impossible dips in the graph. An artifact, Ito-kun. A software glitch. Or your equipment is picking up a harmonic from a new broadcast tower and misinterpreting the data. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. He smiled, a thin, dismissive line. Don't go chasing ghosts. Calibrate your gear. His denial was a wall I couldn't breach. It was worse than being ignored, it was being patronized. My evidence, the chilling, concrete proof I had captured, was dismissed as a technical error. The isolation I had once cultivated as a sanctuary now felt like a prison cell. I was the only one who could see the bars. I began to map them. Every day after work, I'd walk the city with a portable recorder and a notepad. I marked the locations of the listeners on a digital map of Kyoto. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. They weren't randomly distributed. They clustered. They were drawn to places of age and resonance. Not just the famous temples like Kinkikuji or Kayamizadera, but the smaller, quieter places. An old stone Jizo statue tucked into a residential alley. A forgotten well in the grounds of a sub-shrine. The ancient camphor tree in the grounds of the Shimagamo shrine. The common denominator was old stone, deep roots, and a palpable sense of quiet history. It was as if they were drawn to the city's bones. My secondary mystery, the one that kept me up at night, was a single, repeating phrase I found buried in an obscure folklore journal at the university library. I'd been researching tales of sound and silence in Heian-era Japan, looking for any precedent. The article was about the Atsuro Bune, the hollow ship legend, but a footnote mentioned a different, more obscure belief from the region around Mount Kurama. It spoke of the Kukio no Yuta, the song of emptiness. It was said to be a sound that did not fill the ear, but emptied it, a call that drew spirits back to the earth. The text described those who heard it as becoming placid and distant, as if listening to the memory of their own non-existence. The author dismissed it as a poetic metaphor for death. I wasn't so sure. My apartment transformed from a sanctuary into a paranoid laboratory. Spectrograms and city maps papered the walls. I ate instant noodles over my soundboard, tweaking filters, trying to enhance the negative signal. The sound itself was changing, or perhaps my ability to perceive it was. The rhythmic silence was becoming more complex. It was no longer just a pulse, it had structure, cadence, something that mimicked syntax. It was a language made of holes. I tried to talk to Yumi again. I found her at a campus cafe. She was staring out the window, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in front of her. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a profound and unnerving calm. Yumi-san, I said, sitting opposite her. She turned to me slowly, her eyes unfocused. That smile. Sensei. Have you heard it yet? The quiet sound. I've heard what's behind it, I said, my voice low and urgent. It's not what you think. It's a signal. It's affecting people. Her smile didn't falter. It's helping people. It quiets the noise. The endless chatter. It makes things simple. What is it making you do? Follow, she said simply. Follow what? Where? She turned back to the window. The quietest place. It's calling us home. Her placidity was more terrifying than any panic. Arguing with her was like shouting at the tide. She was already lost to it. My attempt to find an ally had only deepened my sense of being alone, a castaway on an island of sanity that was shrinking by the hour. The city itself was starting to feel different. It was subtle. The trains were running a minute or two late more often. The cashier at the konbini near my apartment sometimes paused mid-transaction, a distant look in her eyes, before snapping back with a confused apology. The normally precise choreography of Kyoto's public life was developing a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. There were more quiet moments, more empty spaces. The contagion wasn't just infecting the people, it was thinning the very texture of the city's reality. One night, driven by a desperate hunch, I took my equipment to the one place the folklore mentioned by name, Mount Kurama. I took the last Eisen train to the base of the mountain. The air was cool and smelled of cedar and damp earth. I walked the winding path up towards the main temple, my footsteps loud in the encroaching darkness. I didn't go to the temple itself. My research had pointed to a specific spot off the main path, a small, unvisited shrine dedicated to a minor water deity, marked on old maps as being near a deep spring. I found it nestled in a grove of bamboo, almost swallowed by the forest. And there, in the small clearing, were 5 people. They stood perfectly still, facing a small stone shrine that was little more than a moss-covered rock. They weren't interacting. They weren't chanting. They were just listening. I set up my parabolic dish, my heart hammering against my ribs. I aimed it at the stone. I put on my headphones and cranked the gain, filtering everything, focusing on the narrow band of negative frequency. And it hit me. It was no longer just a silent pulse. It was clear. A complex, multi-layered composition of structured nothingness. It had movements, refrains, crescendos of absolute void. It was an orchestra playing an anti-symphony. It was horrifying. It was beautiful. And for one terrifying second, my analytical mind faltered, and I felt the pull of it. The desire to just let go, to stop processing, and to let the emptiness wash over me. The urge to hear the comforting static instead of the terrifying truth. I ripped the headphones off, gasping, my skin slick with cold sweat. I had my proof. The source wasn't a broadcast tower. It wasn't a mass delusion. It was here. It was ancient. And it was singing. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Back in my lab, the recording from Kurama became my Rosetta Stone. I spent 3 sleepless days analyzing it, the impossible waveform scrolling across my monitors like a dead man's EKG. The complexity was staggering. It wasn't random, it was information. The patterns of silence were too intricate, too deliberate. It was a language, and I was beginning to understand its grammar. My theory solidified, hardening from paranoid speculation into terrifying certainty. The static, the Shizukana Oto, was the brain's defense mechanism. A self-generated buffer. The human mind, confronted with a signal that was fundamentally subtractive, a signal that represented not the presence of something but the absence of it, could not cope. So it filled the void with a gentle, meaningless noise. It chose a comforting lie over an incomprehensible truth. But what was the truth? What was the Kukio no Yuta saying? It wasn't words. It was concepts, delivered directly. The silent song spoke of dissolution. Of patterns unwinding. Of the sweet, simple relief of non-being. It wasn't a call to a place, but to a state. It didn't say, come here, it said, become nothing. The city was changing more rapidly now. The effect was cumulative, like a slow-motion avalanche. It wasn't chaos, it was the opposite. A creeping, orderly entropy. One morning, the entire fleet of city buses on the east side of town simply stopped. The drivers were found sitting in their seats, hands on the wheel, staring peacefully out the windshields, listening. The news reported it as a wildcat strike, but I knew better. Entire offices would fall silent, the workers sitting placidly at their desks, screensavers dancing on their monitors. The phenomenon was so quiet, so non-violent, that society struggled to classify it. It wasn't a sickness, there was no pathogen. It wasn't a protest, there were no demands. It was a quiet, collective resignation. The government response was baffled and slow, a mixture of public health advisories about auditory fatigue and a quiet increase in police patrols, though the police had no one to arrest. My map of listeners was no longer a series of clusters. It was becoming a web, the lines of pilgrimage connecting the nodes, the old stones, the deep wells, the ancient trees. They were moving now. Not with any urgency, but with a slow, inexorable drift. They walked out of their homes, leaving doors unlocked. They stepped out of their cars in traffic. They gathered in the places of power, their numbers swelling from dozens to hundreds. The area around the Fushimi Inari shrine, with its thousands of vermilion torii gates forming a spiritual tunnel up the mountain, became a major convergence point. The tourists were gone, the path was now filled with the silent, smiling listeners, standing like statues between the gates. My last hope was Professor Tanaka. My mentor. The voice of scientific reason. Armed with my new recording and my terrifyingly coherent theory, I went to his office. He looked tired, his desk messier than I'd ever seen it. Tanaka-sensei, I began, my voice tight. I was right. It's coming from the ground. From geologically or historically significant sites. The signal is real. I played him the recording from Kurama. I didn't just show him the waveform, I routed the audio through a processor designed to translate the negative signal into an audible, positive space equivalent. It was a monstrous sound, a chorus of grinding stones and tearing fabric, the sound of reality being unwritten. Tanaka recoiled, his face pale. My God, Ito-kun. What is that? That's what they're hearing, I said, my heart pounding. I had finally broken through. That's what their brains are shielding them from with the static. He stared at the speaker as if it were a venomous snake. He was shaken. He believed me. A wave of relief washed over me. I wasn't alone anymore. Let me hear the original, he whispered, his academic curiosity warring with his fear. The raw signal from your headphones. I hesitated. Sensei, I don't think that's a good idea. I need to understand the phenomenon as it is perceived. I am a scientist, he insisted, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. Reluctantly, I unplugged the processor and handed him my high-fidelity headphones. He placed them over his ears. I watched his face. For 10 seconds, he just listened, his expression a mask of concentration. Then, 20 seconds. 30. The tension in his brow slackened. The hard line of his mouth softened. A look of profound revelation dawned in his eyes. He slowly took off the headphones and placed them on the desk. A gentle, beatific smile spread across his face. It was the smile. The listener's smile. Ah, he sighed, a sound of pure contentment. I see. My blood turned to ice. Sensei. You were wrong, Ito-kun, he said, his voice soft and distant. You've been fighting it. That's why it sounds so monstrous to you. You just have to let go. He looked at me, but his gaze was focused somewhere beyond me. It's so quiet. All the noise is gone. It's so beautifully quiet. He had succumbed. My last ally, the fortress of logic I had hoped to shelter in, had crumbled into dust. He didn't hear the horrifying void. His mind, finally pushed to the brink, had chosen the lie. It had generated the static. He was one of them. I backed out of his office, leaving him smiling at the wall. The university hallway, once a bustling artery of intellect and ambition, felt vast and silent. I was utterly, completely alone. The threat wasn't a monster to be fought. It wasn't a villain to be unmasked. The threat was an idea, a song of surrender whispered from the earth itself. And its most powerful weapon wasn't fear, but peace. How do you fight a war against contentment? How do you save people who don't want to be saved? I ran. I ran from the campus. From the city that was quietly hollowing itself out. My research, my maps, my recordings, they all pointed to one final place. The epicenter. The source from which all the other points resonated. My map wasn't a web anymore, it was a spiral, and at its center was a location I had overlooked, hidden in plain sight. A place marked on ancient maps not with a shrine, but with a simple symbol for, well, deep in a bamboo forest behind the main paths of Hiroshima. The Well of Silence. I knew I had to go there. Not to stop it, I knew, with chilling certainty, that it couldn't be stopped. I had to go to understand. I had to face the conductor of this silent orchestra. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The path to the Well of Silence was not on any tourist map. It was a Kemonomikai, an animal trail, winding through the dense Hiroshima bamboo grove. The towering green stalks formed a cathedral around me, their leaves whispering in the wind. That sound, the natural rustle of bamboo, was a fragile melody about to be consumed by an overwhelming silence. As I drew closer, the ambient sounds of the world began to fray at the edges. The chirping of a cricket would start, then simply stop midway through its call. The rustle of leaves would vanish into a pocket of dead air. The world was being edited, pieces of its soundtrack deleted one by one. The negative sound in my head grew from a whisper to a roar. It was no longer a signal I was detecting, it was the fundamental medium through which I was moving. It pressed on my eardrums, a physical pressure, a feeling of being submerged. It was the sound of a vacuum, and it was pulling the world in. I broke through into a clearing. And I saw it. The clearing was circular, the bamboo forming a perfect wall around it. In the center was a well, not of wood or brick, but carved from a single, massive black stone, slick with moss and age. It was sealed with a heavy stone lid, etched with characters so ancient they were like abstract patterns. And around the well, standing in concentric circles, were the listeners. Hundreds of them. Yumi was there. Professor Tanaka was there. The man from the bus stop, the woman from the flower shop. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent congregation, all facing the well. Their faces held expressions of ecstatic peace. They had followed the quiet. They had come home. I stood at the edge of the clearing, my last piece of equipment in my hand, a single, exquisitely sensitive microphone connected to a portable recorder. I had to get one pure, uncorrupted recording at the source. It was the last act of Kenji Ito, the sound engineer. The man who documented noise. I took a step forward, and the pressure intensified. The anti-symphony was deafening. It was not a song of non-existence anymore, it was the active, architectural plan of unraveling. I could feel the space between my own atoms vibrating with it, a hum that threatened to pull me apart. I saw the world through a shimmering haze, as if reality itself were losing its resolution. This was the confrontation. Not a battle, but a choice. To cling to the frantic, noisy, beautiful chaos of existence, or to accept the elegant, simple perfection of the void. I looked at the faces of the listeners. They weren't zombified. They weren't lost. They were found. The static in their heads was a lullaby, a final gift from their consciousness to ease the transition. It was the gentle hiss of the television turning off after the broadcast of reality had ended. My own mind was at its breaking point. The raw, unfiltered signal was tearing at my sanity. The urge to build my own wall of static, to let the comforting hiss wash over me and join the smiling congregation, was immense. It was a siren song offering the one thing I had craved my entire life, true quiet. But my curse was also my gift. I could not lie to myself about the nature of a sound. I let the recorder fall from my hand. It hit the mossy ground with a soft thud, one final, real sound. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed. The choice was not between sanity and madness. It was not between life and death. It was between two different kinds of perception. I closed my eyes. I stopped fighting it. I stopped analyzing, filtering, trying to understand. I just listened. And the horrifying negative roar ceased. When I let go of my identity as an observer, the signal changed. Without the resistance of my conscious mind, the Kukio no Yuta flowed through me. It was not an absence. It was a presence of a different order. It was the resonance of the stone, the memory of the carbon in my bones, the silence that cradled the stars. It wasn't unmaking the world, it was reminding it of what it was before it became noise. It was not a contagion. It was a revelation. It was not an invasion. It was a return. I opened my eyes. The world was the same, yet utterly different. The listeners were still there, smiling their placid smiles, hearing their gentle static. They were shielded, hearing only a comforting echo of the truth. But I heard it all. I sat there, among the silent congregation, but not one of them. They were at the shores of the ocean, hearing the soothing crash of the waves. I was in the crushing, silent, and brilliant abyss. I was not at peace. Peace is a human concept. I was attuned. I still live in Kyoto. The city is much quieter now. There are vast, empty spaces. The symphony of noise has been thinned to a minimalist quartet. I no longer need my anechoic chamber. I no longer need my headphones. The world fell away, and in its place was the perfect, unending quiet I had always been searching for. It is not silence. It is the sound of home. The quiet contagion, the place next door. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The soul of Sao Paulo is noise. It's the constant, grinding hum of the transito, a 10 million person orchestra playing a symphony of impatience. It's the shout of the man selling pão de queijo from his cart, the frantic bark of a Spitz in a high-rise apartment, the samba rhythm leaking from a corner botico. My life was scored to this soundtrack. On my scooter, a sturdy Honda Biz I'd nicknamed Timosa, the stubborn one, I was a delivery driver, a tiny, fast-moving corpuscle in the city's vast circulatory system. My name is Clara, and I ferried everything from acai bowls to legal documents across the sprawling beast of a city. The job paid for my tiny apartment in Bella Vista and, just barely, for my art supplies. In the few hours I wasn't weaving through traffic, I sketched. I drew the city's jagged edges, the faces etched with worry and laughter, the beautiful, chaotic mess of it all. My subjects were real, flawed, and alive. One of my most frequent delivery zones was Villa Maddalena, a labyrinth of steep hills, colorful graffiti, and charming, slightly ramshackle houses. It was the heart of the city's bohemian spirit. My favorite customer there was Senora Mendez in a building on Rua Girasol. She was a woman in her late 60s who lived in a state of glorious disarray, surrounded by two yappy Lhasa Apsos and towers of books she had no intention of ever reading. Clara, Minha Querida, she'd greet me at the door, her hair a silver firework, a smudge of flour invariably on her cheek. Come in, come in. The dogs will not eat you, I promise. Mostly. I'd hand over her package, usually expensive yarn for a knitting project she'd abandon in a week, and she'd press a still-warm coccinelle into my hand, insisting I stay for a tiny cup of coffee that was strong enough to dissolve steel. Her apartment was a museum of her impulses, half-finished paintings, mismatched furniture, a dozen varieties of wilting herbs on the windowsill. It was vibrant. It was her. It was on a Tuesday in early October, the air thick with the promise of a summer storm, that I first saw the house. I was waiting for Senora Mendez to find her wallet when my eyes drifted to the property next to her building. It was a single-story house, which was unusual in itself amidst the encroaching apartment blocks. It was painted a soft, unassuming shade of eggshell white. The lawn was a perfect, uniform green, the windows were spotless, and a single, flawless camellia bush stood by the porch. It was perfect. Too perfect. And wrong. I was certain that lot had been empty. For the 2 years I'd been delivering on this street, it was a fenced-off patch of dirt and defiant weeds, a casualty of some stalled construction project. I remembered it distinctly because a brilliant splash of graffiti art, a woman's face dissolving into a flock of birds, had adorned the concrete wall at the back. "Señora Mendez," I said, when she finally returned with her purse. "When did they finish building that house next door? It went up so fast." She glanced over my shoulder, her brow barely furrowing. "What house, dear?" "Oh, that one." She gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's always been there. Belongs to the Silvas. A quiet couple." I stared at her. "No, it hasn't. I swear to you, that lot was empty last week. There was graffiti." "Clara, the memory plays tricks," she said, her smile kind but patronizing. "Especially when you rush around in this city's madness all day. You're mixing it up with another street." I let it go. She was older, and I was perpetually exhausted. Maybe she was right. Maybe the Sao Paulo transito was finally grinding down my synapses. But as I rode away, I couldn't shake the image of that pristine house. It didn't fit. It was like a typo in the page of the neighborhood, a single, perfectly kerned letter in a sentence of frantic handwriting. A week later, I had another delivery for Señora Mendez. This time, it was medication from a pharmacy. I buzzed her apartment, and the door clicked open without her usual shouted greeting. I took the elevator up and knocked. The door opened. It was Señora Mendez, but it was also not. Her silver hair was combed back into a neat, severe bun. She wore a simple, beige dress, perfectly ironed. There was no flower on her cheek. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was level, placid. "Tudo bem, Señora Mendez?" I asked, holding out the paper bag. "Everything is well, thank you." She took the bag and passed me a credit card. The transaction was silent, efficient. The dogs were nowhere to be seen or heard. I glanced past her into the apartment. The towers of books were gone, replaced by a few neatly stacked art history volumes on a polished coffee table. The half-finished paintings were gone from the walls. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The silence was unnerving. "Where are Pipoca and Picoca?" I asked, naming her dogs. "They are in their room," she said. "It is their designated quiet time." Designated quiet time? These were dogs who considered the sound of a falling leaf an act of war. "Are you feeling all right?" I pressed, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "I've never felt more orderly," she replied, a faint, serene smile on her face. "My new neighbors have been a wonderful influence. They showed me the importance of having a place for everything, and everything in its proper place." My blood ran cold. "Your new neighbors?" "The Silvas," she said, gesturing vaguely towards the pristine white house. "Such a peaceful couple. I had coffee with them yesterday. It was very clarifying." She completed the payment on my handheld machine and handed it back. "Thank you for your service," she said, the words as sterile as a hospital corridor. Then she closed the door, leaving me alone in the hallway, the faint scent of lemon mocking the memory of chaotic, coffee-scented warmth. I walked back to my scooter in a daze. It wasn't just that she had changed, it was the way she had changed. The vibrant, messy, wonderful Señora Mendez had been edited. Smoothed over. All her interesting, jagged edges had been sanded down, leaving something polite, predictable, and utterly hollow. Over the next few weeks, the quiet contagion spread. I saw Seu Jorge, the fiery owner of a dusty, cluttered bookstore in Pinheiros, a man who loved to argue about football and politics with every customer. I delivered a box of new editions to his shop. A week prior, he'd visited a friend in Vila Madalena. Now, his store was organized by publisher, then alphabetically by author. The comfortable clutter was gone. He greeted me with a calm nod. "A busy day requires an organized mind," he said, when I commented on the change. He didn't offer an opinion on anything. He just scanned the books into his inventory. The passion, the fire that made his shop a hub of intellectual sparring, had been extinguished. Then it was the Tanaka family on my route, whose kids were always screaming and drawing on the walls. After a playdate at the White House, their apartment became a sanctuary of silence. Their weekly order of 4 large, messy pepperoni pizzas was replaced by a recurring order of 4 identical quinoa salads. Each time, the story was the same. A visit to the house on Rua Girasol. And then, the change. They became more polite. More punctual. Their lives, once a sprawling, unpredictable mural of human experience, were repainted in shades of beige. They didn't become zombies or monsters. They became placid. Functional. Empty. I started avoiding Rua Girasol whenever I could, my heart pounding every time the app tried to send me there. I took longer routes, sacrificing time and money to skirt the edge of that quiet, orderly void. I was watching my city, my vibrant, chaotic, noisy Sao Paulo, have its soul quietly, politely, surgically removed, one person at a time. And no one else seemed to notice. The house had always been there, they'd say. And they were always so much better now. So much more organized. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The rationalizations I'd built began to crumble. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't mass gentrification or a new wellness trend. It was a creeping wrongness, and I was the only one who seemed to have the password to see it. My sketchbook, once filled with the expressive faces of the city, now became a logbook. I started a new section titled The Lost. Entry 1, Senora Mendez. Last seen herself October 12th. Visited the house October 18th. Symptoms, extreme tidiness, loss of spontaneity, placid demeanor. Favorite phrase, everything in its proper place. Entry 2, SEU Jorge. Last seen himself October 24th. Visited the house October 29th. Symptoms, loss of passionate opinions, obsessive organization, emotional neutrality. Favorite phrase, an organized mind. I documented every case I encountered, cross-referencing their addresses with their proximity to Villa Madalena. The pattern was undeniable. A visit to the house was the point of infection. My isolation became a palpable thing, a heavy cloak I wore even in the suffocating heat of the city. I tried to talk about it, once, with Mateus. He was a fellow art student who worked nights at a bar. We'd often share a cheap beer after our shifts, complaining about money and dreaming about our first gallery show. We were sitting on the low wall outside the university, the city lights painting the smoggy sky orange. "Something strange is happening," I began, my voice lower than I intended. I told him about Senora Mendez, about SEU Jorge, about the house that wasn't there and now was. I tried to explain the change, the hollowing out. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed with concern. But it was concern for me. "Clara," he said gently, putting his hand on my arm. "You're working 60 hours a week. You're barely sleeping. Sao Paulo, it can get to you. It's a high-stress environment. You're an artist, your brain is wired to see patterns, to find meaning where there might be none. It's called confirmation bias." "No, this is real," I insisted, my voice rising. "They're all the same now. They even use the same phrases. People follow trends," he reasoned. "Maybe it's some new self-help book everyone's reading. Marie Kondo, but for your soul, you know." He was trying to be kind, to ground me in a reality that was slipping through my fingers. But his logic felt like a betrayal. He couldn't see it. He was looking at my map of madness and telling me it was just a drawing. The conversation ended with a strained silence. After that, Our late-night beers became less frequent. I was drifting away from the last anchor I had. The subplot that truly began to haunt me, however, involved my vovo, my grandmother. She lived in a small, quiet apartment in Higienopolis. A world away from the chaos I inhabited. She was my only family in the city. Her memory, like old lace, was becoming more delicate, more prone to tearing. She'd forget names, repeat stories, lose track of her days. It was the normal, heartbreaking decline of a sharp mind in its 9th decade. But now, her natural forgetting became tangled with my paranoia about the unnatural emptiness spreading from the house. When she'd forget my name for a moment, my blood would run cold. Was this age, or was it the beginning of the same erasure? The fear was irrational. She lived across town, she'd never been near that house, but the horror of the contagion was that it mimicked a kind of death. A death of the self. I started visiting her more often, clinging to her stories, her quirks, the specific, chaotic pattern of her life, terrified that it too could be smoothed over, organized into nothingness. Her fading memory became a personal, terrifying reflection of the city's fading soul. One evening, driven by a desperate need for proof, I went back to Rua Girasol after my shift. The street was quiet. Lights glowed from the windows of the surrounding apartments. The White House, however, was dark, yet it seemed to absorb the ambient light, its perfection a dead spot in my vision. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and tried to take a picture. The screen flickered. I aimed the lens at the flawless camellia bush. The image on my phone warped, the pixels dissolving into a smear of green and pink. I tried again, focusing on the front door. The image stuttered, glitched, and then the phone simply shut down, its screen black and lifeless. It wouldn't turn back on. A man I recognized from my deliveries, a lawyer from the 3rd floor of Senora Mendez's building, walked out of his own apartment and headed straight for the White House. He walked with a new, clipped purpose. He didn't knock. The door swung open silently before he reached it, revealing a brief glimpse of a simple, warmly lit hallway within. He stepped inside, and the door clicked shut with a sound of utter finality. I didn't wait to see him come out. I kick-started Timosa and fled, the scooter's engine sounding thin and pathetic against the profound silence that emanated from that place. My search for answers became more frantic. I spent hours in internet cafes, my dead phone a useless brick in my bag. I scoured online archives, looking for old real estate listings, municipal records, anything. Finally, I found it. On a satellite imaging service, I navigated to Rua Girasol and used the historical view feature. I clicked back, year by year. 2022, 2021. 2020, there it was. A satellite image from 18 months ago, crisp and clear. Senora Mendez's building stood starkly against an empty, weed-choked lot. No house. No perfect lawn. No camellia bush. I took a screenshot, my heart hammering against my ribs. I printed a dozen copies at a copy shop. It was my proof. My shield against the gaslighting of a world gone quietly insane. I am not crazy, I whispered to myself, the flimsy paper feeling as heavy and real as a stone tablet. It wasn't there. Now I just had to find someone, anyone, who was still capable of believing me. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. My list of the unchanged was shrinking. It felt like I was tracking an endangered species on the brink of extinction. At the top of that list, a stubborn holdout, was SEU Jorge. Or rather, the memory of him. My logbook told me he'd been converted, but a desperate, irrational part of me refused to believe it. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe he was faking it. Clutching my printouts of the satellite map, I went back to his bookstore. The bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that once heralded a loud, welcoming tirade about the state of Brazilian football. Now, there was only silence. SEU Jorge was behind the counter, polishing his glasses with a microfiber cloth. He looked up, his expression one of mild, professional inquiry. "Pois Neo?" he asked. "Can I help you?" "Seu Jorge," I said, spreading one of the satellite images on his obsessively clean countertop. "Look at this. This is your friend's street in Vila Madalena. From last year. Look." He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning it without a flicker of recognition. He compared it to a current map on his computer screen. "The data seems to be out of date," he said calmly, placing the printout back down and pushing it slightly towards me. "There is a residence there now. A very well-maintained property. No, don't you understand? It wasn't there. It just appeared. And the people who go inside, they change. You changed, Seu Jorge. You used to have books piled to the ceiling. You used to have opinions." My voice cracked with desperation. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Confusion. A ghost of a memory. But then it was gone, smoothed over by the placid calm. "Clara, I believe you are distressed," he said, his voice even. "My life has never been more coherent. Routine is the foundation of peace. Perhaps you are overwhelmed. There are ways to find order." He said it. The mantra of the lost. My heart sank. He wasn't just a victim, he was a potential vector. He was offering me the cure. My ally was gone, replaced by a polite automaton who wanted to file me away alphabetically under H for hysterical. I backed out of the store, leaving the proof on his counter. He simply picked it up and dropped it neatly into a recycling bin. The escalation came quietly, insidiously. The changed were no longer just passive victims. They were becoming synchronized. One morning, making a delivery in a new, infected neighborhood, I saw it. At precisely 8:15 a.m., on 3 different blocks, the front doors of 5 different houses opened. 5 people, all of whom I knew had been changed, stepped out, locked their doors, and began walking towards the metro station. They didn't walk together, but their movements were uncannily similar, the same brisk pace, the same neutral expression, the same way of holding their briefcases. It was like watching a flock of birds that had forgotten they were supposed to be human. The environmental warping grew more pronounced, but only if you knew how to look. Streetlights on certain corners would flicker in a slow, rhythmic pulse, a pattern that felt less like a faulty wire and more like a deliberate signal. Shadows in the late afternoon sun would sometimes seem to stretch too far, clinging to the changed as they walked, as if offering them comfort. I saw a cat arch its back and hiss at a perfectly normal, empty doorway that a changed person had just walked through. The world's physics were fraying at the edges, and only the animals and I seemed to notice. The direct threat came on a rainy Thursday. The Garoa, Sao Paulo's signature fine mist, slicked the streets, and I was running behind. My app directed me to an address I didn't recognize, near the border of the Vila Madalena contagion zone. It was a delivery of artisanal cheese. As I pulled up, the customer came out to meet me on the sidewalk. It was the lawyer from Senora Mendez's building, the one I'd seen enter the White House. "Clara, isn't it?" he said, his smile pleasant but utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes were like polished stones. "Yes," I said, my hand tight on the handlebars of my scooter. "I have your delivery." "Thank you," he said, taking the small package. He didn't move to leave. He just stood there, the drizzle beating on his expensive coat. "You work very hard. Rushing all over the city. It must be very chaotic for you." "I manage," I said, my throat tight. "There is a better way," he continued, his voice soft, reasonable. "A way to quiet the noise. To put everything in its proper order. My friends, the Silvas, are so good at helping people find structure. Their home is a place of profound peace. You look like you could use some peace, Clara." It wasn't an invitation. It was a diagnosis. They knew I was unchanged. They knew I was watching. The contagion was not just a passive force, it was aware. It had an agenda. It wanted to tidy up the loose ends. And I was a very, very loose end. "I'm fine," I stammered, fumbling to start Timosa. "I have to go." "Of course," he said, his smile never wavering. "But the offer stands. When the chaos becomes too much, you know where to find us. Sooner or later, everyone seeks a little order." He turned and walked away. I watched him go, my body trembling. This was no longer just me observing a phenomenon. I was now part of the phenomenon I was observing. I was a bug in their perfect, sterile system. And they were coming for me with a dustpan and brush. My theory solidified in that moment, a terrifying and cohesive whole. The house wasn't just a house. It was a filter. An ontological processing plant. It took in the messy, vibrant, chaotic data of human personality and spat out a clean, simplified, compatible version. It wasn't killing people. It was standardizing them. Creating a more efficient, predictable world, one mind at a time. And its recruitment phase had just begun. Phase 4, confrontation/revelation and aftermath. The breaking point came in the form of a phone call from my vovo. Her voice was thin and reedy, but there was an unusual clarity to it that immediately set off alarm bells. "Clara, Minhanita," she said. "A lovely woman from my building, Dona Alice, has invited me for coffee this afternoon. With some new friends of hers. They live in such a charming little house in Villa Maddalena." Dona Alice. I knew her. A sweet woman who sent my vovo soup whenever she was sick. I'd delivered a package to Dona Alice 2 weeks ago. I remembered her telling me she was going to visit a cousin near Rua Girassol. The world tilted on its axis. They weren't waiting for me anymore. They were using my own life, my own love, as bait. They were going to tidy up my grandmother. "Vovo, no." I shouted into the phone, my voice raw with panic. "Don't go. I'm coming to get you. Stay there. Lock your door. Please. Don't be silly, Clara." "It's just coffee," she said, but there was a waver of confusion in her voice. The command was probably too sharp, too disordered for her to process easily. I didn't wait for her to argue. I was on my scooter in seconds, pushing Timosa harder than ever before, the engine screaming in protest as I cut through traffic with reckless abandon. The 30-minute drive became a 15-minute blur of near misses and blaring horns. The noise of the city, the chaos I had come to fear was being erased, was now my ally, a frantic prayer for speed. I burst into her apartment building, took the stairs 2 at a time, and found her standing by her door, putting on her favorite floral scarf. Dona Alice was with her, her face a mask of serene helpfulness. "Clara, what a nice surprise," Dona Alice said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "You can join us. There's plenty of room." "We're not going anywhere," I snarled, grabbing my vovo's arm. She looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion. "Clara, you're hurting me." "She's just excited," Dona Alice said, her smile unwavering. "It's a very peaceful place. It will be good for your grandmother. It will be good for you." I looked into her empty eyes and saw the abyss. There was no reasoning with her. I pulled my grandmother away from the door, back into the apartment. "Vovo, we have to go. Now. We're going on a trip." "A trip? But I haven't packed." "I'll pack for you," I said, my mind racing. I threw her essentials into a bag, medication, a few changes of clothes, the worn photo album she kept by her bed. All the while, Dona Alice stood in the doorway, not moving, not trying to stop me physically, but radiating a powerful, silent pressure. A pressure of correctness. Of order. "This is unnecessarily chaotic, Clara," she said. "You are causing distress. There is a simpler way." "Get out of my way," I said, pushing past her with my grandmother in tow. For a moment, I thought she would block me, but she simply stepped aside. The change didn't use force. They used persuasion. They presented order as the only logical choice. Violence was messy. It was inefficient. I got Vovo down to the street and onto the back of my scooter. It was insane, dangerous, but it was the only way. As I revved the engine, I looked back. Donna Alice was standing on the curb, watching us. And she wasn't alone. Down the block, two other figures had emerged from their buildings. They stood silently, watching us leave. The lawyer. A baker I used to know. They weren't chasing us. They were simply observing the anomaly, the piece of data that refused to be processed, as it fled the system. I didn't drive home. I didn't drive anywhere safe. I drove straight to Rua Girasol. I had to see it. I had to know what was doing this. I parked the scooter at the end of the block, telling Vovo to stay put, that I would be right back. Her fear and confusion were a painful weight, but my own compulsion was stronger. I walked towards the White House. Its perfection felt like a physical blow. The closer I got, the more the ambient noise of the city seemed to fade, replaced by a low, subaudible hum that vibrated in my teeth. The front door was slightly ajar. The invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic, messy rhythm that was anathema to this place. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. There was no monster. No alien technology. The hallway opened into a simple, tastefully furnished living room. Beige sofa, glass coffee table, minimalist bookshelf. It looked like a page from a furniture catalog. The air was still and cool, utterly silent except for that deep, resonant hum. In the exact center of the room, on a simple wooden pedestal, was a thing. It was a smooth, black, geometric object, no larger than a football. It was a shape that my eyes couldn't quite hold on to. It seemed to have too many sides, or not enough. It slowly rotated, not on an axis, but by seeming to fold in on itself and emerge from a different angle. It wasn't menacing. It wasn't aggressive. It simply was. And as I looked at it, I felt it. A profound, seductive calm. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for weeks began to dissolve. The fear, the panic, the frantic need to escape, all of it started to feel so unnecessary. So messy. The hum resonated with the frantic, chaotic energy within me and promised to smooth it out, to make it coherent. I could feel my own jagged edges, my worries about money, my artistic frustrations, my grief for a changing world, all being gently pulled towards this central point of absolute order. I understood. It wasn't about malice. It was about correction. The universe, in its view, had a typo. And it was fixing it. The temptation to stay, to let go, to be filed and sorted and finally be at peace, was overwhelming. It was the most alluring thing I had ever experienced. A car horn blared from the main road, a sudden, vulgar slash of noise that broke the spell. The sound was ugly, chaotic, and real. It was the sound of my city. It was the sound of being alive. I remembered Vovo on the scooter. I remembered Senora Mendez's mad laugh. I remembered SEU Jorge's passionate, angry face. The messy, beautiful, irreplaceable data of a human soul. With a gasp, I tore my eyes away from the object. The effort was physical, like breaking free from a powerful magnet. I stumbled backward, out the door, into the flawed, noisy, beautifully imperfect world. The hum ceased. The sounds of Sao Paulo rushed back in. I ran to my scooter, my breath coming in ragged sobs. I didn't look back. I drove until the gas tank was nearly empty, heading north, away from the city, Vovo holding on tight behind me, her confused questions lost in the wind. We've been on the road for a week. We're in a small town in Minas Gerais, a place of quiet hills and old churches. Vovo thinks we're on a holiday. Her memory is a blessing now, her inability to hold on to the immediate past a shield. I use my cash to buy us food, to stay in cheap posadas. I've thrown my phone away. I don't look at the news. I am a refugee from an encroaching reality. I escaped, but I am forever changed, haunted not by a monster, but by the allure of its peace. I am a keeper of a dead world's memory, a world of beautiful, glorious chaos. Last night, I walked to the edge of town to sketch the sunset. Looking down into the small, sleepy valley, I saw the grid of streets, the little houses. And my hand froze. On a cul-de-sac at the far end of the town, there was one house that was just a little too neat. Its lawn was a perfect green. Its paint was a flawless, unassuming eggshell white. The quiet is spreading. And I am running out of places to go. Echoes in the sky. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life was built on the elegant certainty of physics. As a meteorologist for Environment Canada, I didn't predict the weather, I interpreted the data that did. Barometric pressure, dew point, wind shear, sea surface temperature, these were the syllables of a language the sky spoke, a language I understood. From our office in a glass and steel tower overlooking False Creek, I translated the atmosphere's intentions for the 6 million souls of the Lower Mainland. It was a job of precision, a bulwark against the chaos I felt simmering just beneath the surface of my own orderly life. Vancouver was a city of reliable patterns, the rain in November, the cherry blossoms in April, the way the sun, on the rare clear days of winter, would slash across the North Shore mountains, setting their snowy peaks alight. The first tremor in my reality was small enough to be a rounding error. It was a Tuesday in early October, a day that was supposed to be textbook. A high-pressure system was parked firmly over the coast, promising crisp, autumnal sunshine. My models were unanimous: 17 degrees Celsius, clear skies, light northwesterly winds. Yet, looking out the window, the light was wrong. It was thin and silvery, the color of a winter afternoon, not the rich gold of autumn. The shadows of the buildings across the creek were too long, too sharp for 2 in the afternoon. "David, does the light seem off to you?" I asked, turning away from the panoramic window. David Chen, my boss and a man who had been forecasting weather since before I was born, glanced up from his monitor. He was a placid man, his calm a comforting presence in the high-stakes world of storm warnings. "Off how?" "Like it's later than it is. Like dusk is coming early." He squinted at the window, then back at his screen. "Says clear and 17 degrees. Looks clear and 17 degrees to me, Elara. Maybe you need to get your eyes checked." He smiled, a gentle dismissal. I smiled back, a tight, forced thing. He was probably right. I'd been working too many hours, staring at too many isobaric charts. I strain. Stress. But the feeling lingered. On my way home, walking towards the Skitran station, I saw a woman unfurl a large black umbrella. I instinctively looked up at the sky. It was a vast, unbroken bowl of pale blue. Not a wisp of a cloud. A few other people had umbrellas too, tucked under their arms or dangling from their wrists like dormant bats. It was bizarre, a tiny tear in the social fabric, but easily explained away. Maybe there was a 1% chance of a pop-up shower in the forecast I'd missed. Or maybe it was a fashion statement. People were strange. The next day, the anomaly was in the data itself. A buoy in the Strait of Georgia, buoy 46146, was reporting a water temperature 3 degrees warmer than every model suggested it should be. I ran a diagnostic. The buoy sensors were functioning perfectly. I cross-referenced with satellite data. The satellite confirmed the model, not the buoy. "We've got a ghost, David," I said, pointing to the conflicting numbers. "Buoy 46146 is on the fritz. Just flag it for maintenance," he said, not looking up. "Use the satellite data." I did, but it gnawed at me. Buoys didn't just go on the fritz in such a specific way. They failed, they went silent. They didn't lie with such confidence. That weekend, I called my younger brother, Liam. He was a sculptor, a man who lived in the world of textures and feelings, not data points. He lived on Bowen Island, a short ferry ride away, but a world apart from the city's grid. "How's the weather out there?" I asked, a force of professional habit. "It's incredible, he said, his voice buzzing with an artist's enthusiasm. "The sky's been this amazing bruised purple color all day, even though it's sunny. The shadows are just vibrating. I've been trying to capture it in clay all afternoon." My blood ran cold. "Liam, it's not purple. I'm looking at the live camera feed for Snug Cove right now. It's blue. A bit hazy, but blue." No, you have to be here to feel it," he insisted, misunderstanding completely. "It's the quality of the light. It's changing. It's wonderful. It's changing." The phrase echoed in my mind. For Liam, it was inspiration. For me, it was a fundamental violation of the laws I had built my life around. The following week, the predicted first snow on Grouse Mountain didn't arrive. The temperature at the peak stubbornly hovered at 3 degrees Celsius, too warm for snow, despite every long-range model screaming for a dump of at least 10 centimeters. But when I turned on the evening news, the reporter was standing there, bundled in a parka, with what looked like pristine white snow all around her. "It's a winter wonderland up here, folks," she chirped, as families in snowsuits behind her made snow angels and threw snowballs. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled up my terminal, my fingers flying across the keyboard, accessing the raw feed from the Grouse Mountain weather station. Temperature, 3.1 degrees Celsius. Precipitation, 0 millimeters, ground cover, bare. I looked back at the TV. The reporter was catching a snowflake on her tongue, laughing. The snow on the screen was real. People were interacting with it. But my instruments, the unblinking, unbiased eyes of science, said it wasn't there. I felt a wave of vertigo, the solid ground of my world tilting sickeningly. Two realities were coexisting. One was on the television, in people's behavior, in my brother's artistic raptures. The other was on my screen, in the cold, hard numbers. And I was the only one who seemed to be able to see both. That night, I started a journal. A physical, paper journal with a good pen. I couldn't trust my computer anymore. I wrote down the date, the official forecast, and then, in a separate column, what I actually saw. The sky's real color. The actual temperature on my balcony thermometer. The strange, quiet things people did. A man meticulously washing his car in a downpour. A group of teenagers sunbathing in the gray, biting chill of a November morning. I was creating an archive of a world that was, according to everyone else, not happening. A weather report from a dying reality. My reality. It was in the third week of my secret log that I noticed the stars. I was an amateur astronomer, a hobby that dovetailed nicely with my profession. I knew the constellations as well as I knew my own neighborhood. Walking home one evening, the sky was unusually clear. I looked up to find Cassiopeia, her familiar W shape a comforting landmark in the celestial sea. But the W was distorted. It was stretched, one of the stars, Skeeter, noticeably dimmer and further away than it should have been. My breath caught in my throat. I looked for Polaris, the North Star, the linchpin of the northern sky. It was there, but fainter. And to its left, where there should have been only the faint smattering of Cepheus, was a bright, pulsating crimson star I had never seen before. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a planet. It was a fixed point of light, as ancient and immovable as the others, but it had no name. It had no history. It shouldn't have been there. The world wasn't just misperceiving the weather. The sky itself, the very canvas of the cosmos, was being repainted. And the quiet contagion wasn't just making people act strangely, it was convincing them that the new, impossible painting was the one that had been hanging there all along. The unease I had felt for weeks began to curdle into a profound and terrifying dread. I was not just witnessing a change. I was witnessing an erasure. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The discrepancies grew bolder, more flagrant. One morning, the entire city of Vancouver woke up to a sky the color of rust. A deep, unsettling ochre that painted the glass towers in hues of dried blood. It felt apocalyptic. I raced to the office, my mind a storm of catastrophic theories, a massive industrial accident. A strange atmospheric dust cloud from a volcanic eruption in Asia. I burst into the office, my journal clutched in my hand. David, look at the sky. We need to issue an air quality advisory, run spectral analysis, something. David was calmly sipping his tea, looking over the morning charts. He glanced out the window at the cinnamon-colored world and gave a small, contented smile. Beautiful sunrise, isn't it? The models predicted this perfectly. High-level cirrostratus clouds catching the light just right. I stared at him, my mouth agape. David, those aren't cirrostratus clouds. The sky is brown. It's 3 hours past sunrise and it looks like we're on Mars. The data can't possibly support this. I pulled up the satellite imagery on my workstation. It showed scattered, normal-looking high-altitude clouds. I pointed frantically from the screen to the window. Look. The data says this, the sky says that. They don't match. David walked over and stood behind me. He looked at my screen, then at the window, then back at the screen. His face was a mask of serene confusion, the kind you might give a child who is insisting their imaginary friend is real. Ilara, they match perfectly. See? The light scattering off the ice crystals. It's exactly as it should be. He patted my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt like a brand. You've been under a lot of pressure. Maybe take a day. Recalibrate. I felt the walls of the office closing in. He didn't just disagree with me, he saw something fundamentally different. The contagion wasn't in his behavior, it was in his perception. The light entered his eyes and his brain told him it was a beautiful sunrise, overriding the raw sensory data with a new, accepted narrative. I left the office, feigning a headache. The isolation was no longer a feeling, it was a physical state. I walked through streets bathed in the eerie, Martian light. No one was panicking. People were jogging, walking their dogs, heading to work. A couple posed for a selfie, grinning at their phone, the caption no doubt proclaiming #Vancouver Sunrise. I was a ghost in my own city, the only one haunted by the memory of a blue sky. My research became my obsession. I spent my nights digging through obscure meteorological forums and academic papers, searching for anything that could explain this mass perceptual shift. I looked into psychotropic pollutants, collective hypnosis, mimetic hazards. Most of it was conspiracy theory nonsense about chemtrails and government mind control rays. It was all noise. But then I found it. Buried in the archives of the University of British Columbia's Physics Department was a series of papers by a Dr. Eris Thorne, a professor of astrophysics who had been denied tenure in the late 90s. His work was highly theoretical, bordering on philosophical. He wrote about informational realism and something he called the Cass-Fuller cascade. His central thesis was that reality, at its most fundamental level, wasn't matter or energy, but information. And like any information system, it could be hacked, corrupted, or overwritten. A cascade, he theorized, would be a recursive error in the base code of reality, where a small anomaly, once observed and accepted by a critical mass of consciousness, would begin to retroactively alter past data to maintain causal consistency. It was madness. It was science fiction. And it was the only thing that explained why the historical data in my own system was beginning to subtly change. I had started taking screenshots of my archives, saving them to an isolated hard drive. Last week, I had pulled up the record for June 10, 2012, a day I remembered vividly because it had hailed during my university graduation. The archive had confirmed it, localized hail, 14:30 Pacific Standard Time. This week, I checked the same entry. It now read, brief, intense rain shower, 14:30 Pacific Standard Time. The hail, my memory of it, was being scrubbed from the official record. The system was healing itself, smoothing over the inconsistencies, and taking my past with it. The secondary mystery, the red herring that almost drove me completely insane, involved a new series of Chinese weather satellites. The Fengyun 5 series. They used a novel form of microwave sounding that was largely a black box to Western agencies. For 2 weeks, I became convinced they were the source. That this was some kind of deliberate attack, a broadcast signal that was warping perception. It gave me a tangible enemy, a focus for my fear. I spent days trying to decrypt their data streams, cross-referencing their orbital paths with the appearance of new anomalies. I found faint correlations, enough to feed my paranoia. It led me to a dead end. The correlations were statistical ghosts. The phenomenon was too pervasive, too fundamental to be caused by a handful of satellites. The answer wasn't in the sky, it was in us. Finding Dr. Thorne became my new purpose. His university records showed he had retired, but there was no forwarding address. I spent a weekend cold calling every Thorne in the Vancouver phone book, feeling more and more like a lunatic with each polite rejection. Finally, a woman's voice on the other end of the line said, "Eris? Oh, he doesn't have a phone anymore. Says the ringing interferes with the background radiation. He lives in that old walk-up in Kitsilano, the one covered in ivy." I found the building an hour later. It was a relic, squeezed between 2 modern glass condos. Ivy crawled over the brick, framing windows that were dark and filled with stacks of books. I pressed the buzzer for apartment 4B, Thorne. For a long moment, there was no answer. I was about to turn away when the speaker crackled to life. "The star in Cephus," a reedy voice rasped. "Is it still red?" My heart stopped. I leaned into the speaker, my voice trembling. It was last night. And it's pulsating at a frequency of 1.2 Hz. There was a long pause. Then, the distinct, heavy buzz of the door lock releasing. I climbed 4 flights of dusty stairs, the air growing thick with the smell of old paper and ozone. The door to 4B was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was a cave of knowledge. Books were stacked to the ceiling, overflowing from shelves onto every available surface. Star charts were pinned to the walls, many of them marked up with frantic red ink, new constellations drawn over the familiar ones. In the center of the room, amidst the clutter, sat a man who looked as ancient as the information surrounding him. He was thin and bird-like, with wild white hair and eyes that burned with a frightening intelligence. This was Eris Thorne. He gestured to a teetering stack of books that might have been a chair. "You're a scientist," he said. It wasn't a question. "You still believe in causality. In objective measurement. That's why you can still see the seams. What is happening?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "What happens when a song is recorded with a faint echo, and every time the song is played, the echo is recorded again, a little louder each time? Eventually, you can't tell which was the original note and which was the echo. The echo becomes the song." He pointed a shaky finger towards the window. Outside, it had begun to rain, a heavy, soaking downpour. The sky was a uniform gray. Yet, on the street below, people were spreading out picnic blankets on the wet grass of the park. A young man in shorts and a t-shirt was enthusiastically applying sunscreen to his girlfriend's back. "They aren't insane," Thorne said, following my gaze. "They are simply listening to the louder song. Their reality is self-consistent. The sun is shining. The ground is dry. The historical data supports it. The memory of the rain, the very concept of it, is fading from the consensus. You and I, we're the ones hearing a song that no one else remembers. His words didn't bring comfort, but they brought a terrifying clarity. I wasn't going mad. The world was. Or rather, it was becoming sane in a new, incomprehensible way. The Casfruller Cascade, I said, the words feeling alien in my mouth. Thorne's eyes widened slightly. So you did your homework. It's not a cascade anymore, my dear. It's a flood. And the levee isn't just broken, it's been retroactively unbuilt. He walked over to a telescope pointed out his window. Not at the sky, but at the reflection of the sky in the glass of the condo tower opposite them. I call it the echo. A reflection of another place, another set of rules, bleeding through. And our world, for whatever reason, is harmonizing with it. The isolation I felt had been a cold, empty thing. Now, sitting in this cluttered room with this strange old man, it transformed. It was no longer just me against the world. It was the two of us, standing on a shore, watching the tide of reality recede, leaving behind a landscape we no longer recognized. And we were utterly, completely powerless to stop it. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The weeks that followed were a descent into a new kind of normal. Eris Thorne became my only confidant, our daily phone calls, he allowed me to buy him a simple burner phone, a lifeline in the sea of placid madness. We were two cartographers charting the shores of a dissolving continent. He provided the theoretical framework, I provided the raw, terrifying data. The sun rose in the west this morning, Eris, I'd say, my voice flat with a fatigue that went bone deep. It came up over the Pacific. The shadows are all wrong. The traffic on the Lions Gate Bridge is flowing as usual. News anchors are wishing everyone a good morning and commenting on the lovely sunrise over Mount Baker. A polarity shift in the informational matrix, he'd murmur back, a tremor of academic excitement in his voice. Fascinating. Did you notice any corresponding geomagnetic fluctuations? No. My instruments show nothing. It's as if the Earth is still spinning the same way, but the light has decided to arrive from the opposite direction. The echo, as Eris called it, began to escalate from passive distortion to something more active. It wasn't violent, not in any conventional sense. It was worse. It was purposeful. The first coordinated event happened on a Thursday. The sky, which my instruments insisted was a uniform blanket of stratus clouds, appeared to the consensus as a swirling vortex of emerald and violet, like a nebula had descended into our atmosphere. I watched from my office window, a prisoner in my glass tower. On the streets below, people stopped. As one, they turned their faces to the sky. From the financial district to the beaches of Kitsilano, millions of people stood motionless, their expressions rapt, blissful. Traffic stopped. Business ceased. For 15 minutes, the entire city was caught in a silent, collective worship of the impossible sky. Then, as quickly as it began, the vortex on the street-level reality faded to a normal blue, and everyone simply went on with their day, as if they hadn't just participated in a synchronized, citywide trance. My attempts to document this were met with a new kind of denial. When I mentioned the citywide pause to David, he looked at me with genuine pity. Ilara, we had a very productive morning, he said softly. You were in the chart review meeting with us. Don't you remember? You gave that excellent presentation on the new seasonal models. My blood froze. I had not been in any meeting. I had been at the window, filming the eerie stillness on my phone. I pulled out my phone to show him the video. I opened my gallery. The video was gone. In its place was a 2-minute clip of me, from an angle I couldn't have filmed, standing at a podium, pointing to a slide presentation. My mouth was moving, but there was no sound. The echo wasn't just changing the present anymore. It was actively fighting back, patching the holes my awareness created, writing me into its narrative. I visited my brother Liam. I needed to see a familiar face, even if he was one of them. His studio was filled with new sculptures, twisted lattices of metal and clay that seemed to defy gravity. They hurt my eyes, their geometries seeming to shift and fold in on themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. "It's the new symmetry," he said, his eyes shining. He ran a hand over a warped spiral of bronze. "The old forms were too rigid, too predictable. The world is showing us its true shape now, L. It's so much more beautiful." "Liam," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Do you remember when we were kids? We went camping in the Rockies. Remember that meteor shower? The Perseids. We stayed up all night counting them." He smiled, a fond but distant look in his eyes. "Of course I do. We watched the aurora. It was so strange to see it that far south. Those beautiful green and red curtains." "No," I whispered. "It wasn't the aurora. It was meteors. Streaks of light. Not curtains. I have a photo. I had the photo. It was in a frame on my bedside table. Me and a goofy, gap-toothed Liam, wrapped in blankets, pointing at a sky filled with the unmistakable slashes of shooting stars. I drove home in a panic, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I ran into my apartment and went straight to my bedroom. The frame was still there. But in the photo, the younger versions of me and my brother were staring up at a sky filled with the rippling, ethereal glow of the northern lights. The meteors were gone. My own memory, my most cherished proof, had been photoshopped by reality itself. I called Eris, choking back sobs. "It's winning, Eris. It's rewriting everything." "It's not about winning," he said, his voice strained. He sounded tired. "It's about consensus. The signal is stronger, and our consciousnesses are leaky vessels." I find myself forgetting things. The name of my first pet. The formula for gravitational lensing. It all feels unimportant. The alliance I had clung to was fraying. Eris wasn't a fellow soldier, he was just another citizen of the old world, and his passport was expiring. He confessed he'd spent the entire previous day trying to map the new constellations, finding a strange, compelling logic in their alien patterns. He was being seduced by the echo's song. I realized with a fresh stab of terror that his awareness didn't make him immune. It just made him a more articulate witness to his own dissolution. The stakes were no longer about preserving the old world. That world was gone, its foundations systematically demolished and replaced. The fight was now for my own mind. The turning point came when the weather itself became actively hostile, though only to me. A forecast of calm, sunny weather would correspond to a street-level reality where people strolled happily. For me, however, a localized, violent microstorm would erupt. Vicious winds would tear at my clothes, and icy rain, which steamed where it hit the dry pavement, would soak me to the bone. I would stumble through the gale, a lone figure battling a storm no one else could see, earning strange looks from people basking in phantom sunlight. The echo was isolating me, targeting me. It knew I was a dissonant note in its grand symphony, and it was trying to silence me. The world was no longer just ignoring me, it was actively trying to punish me for not believing. I was an anomaly in their reality, and it was trying to correct for my presence. The quiet contagion had noticed me, and I was terrified of what it might do next. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't with a monster or an alien intelligence. It was with a choice, presented on a day the sky broke completely. I had driven to the viewpoint at Cypress Mountain, the one that looks out over the entire city, Howe Sound, and, on a clear day, Vancouver Island. Today was not a clear day. My instruments, which I now carried with me in a hardened pelican case, read a steady, drizzling rain and a temperature of 8 degrees Celsius. But what I saw with my eyes, what the world below was experiencing, was something else entirely. The sky was a fractured mosaic. To the east, over the city, a perpetual, silent electrical storm was underway, lightning crawling between the towers without thunder. To the south, The sun and the moon hung side by side in a sky the color of a faded bruise. To the west, over the ocean, the stars were out, forming spiraling, galactic patterns that should have been invisible in the daytime.